In this section, we are going to get into the good administrative stuff. Jira, being the comprehensive tool that it is, allows you to customize pretty much everything. So we will be covering a lot in this section. We will start off by just navigating our way around the administration section and getting familiar with it. Our next task will be to create users and groups and then understand the different level of permissions within Jira. You will see that they are mainly broken into project permissions and global permissions, and so we will spend some time on these as well. Project permissions are related to creating project roles and assigning them to the permissions, and we will walk through a full example that will involve creating a set of users, groups, project roles, and give them different levels of permissions for a particular project. We will then move on to customizing our own issue types, screens, custom fields, and we'll then spend some time making a new workflow and editing an existing workflow, and then incorporating the workflow changes into the Agile board. Part of this will also look at how you can set the behavior of issues when they transition between statuses in a workflow. We will then end the section by walking through all other important aspects of the Jira administration section, and by the end of it, you should have the knowledge to be able to set up a completely brand new Jira instance with everything you need to fulfill your team's needs. So let's get right into it. Alright, let's take our first look at the administration functionality by first seeing how they are laid out and how you would go about navigating them. Now, before we get started, I just want to point out that I am still logged in as the administrator, and so I have full-on admin privileges. So we are going to be focused on this cogwheel because that is how we access pretty much all our admin stuff. So you can see it's kind of broken out into multiple sections. The personal settings, like we've talked before, everyone has access to their own personal settings. But here, now at the top, we've got our Atlassian admin. Now, this is basically your site admin stuff. So again, just to clarify, and this is something we had talked about in the last video, this is where you can see all your users and products under the site, and you can do things like user management in terms of who has access to what products, view your overall billing information, and even add more products such as Confluence, which we'll be doing later in the course. And then below that, you've got your Jira settings, which is your product administration for Jira. Now here, for the site admin stuff, you can see this little icon beside them, which means that when you click on it, it's going to open up in its own tab. So we will look at these in a bit. Let's start off with our Jira settings. So starting from the top, let's look at the system settings. This is basically a bunch of various general configuration settings for Jira. So right off the top, you're taken to the general config page with a bunch of different options. And I think more often than not, you're okay to leave all the settings as the default. And also, we're not going to be going into details for any of these right now. We will revisit them later in the course. I just wanted to point out the kind of stuff that you see in each of these sections. So here you've got things like global permissions. You can change things like your user interface, so your look and feel of the site. You can modify your default system dashboard. They've got import-export functionality, mail settings, things like that that cater to the overall Jira application. And then the next option we have is products. So this basically entails anything to do with your Jira product level settings, whether it's defining who gets access to the application, although when you click on this, this will basically just redirect you back to the site admin settings since it has to do with who can access which application. And then here you've got Jira software configuration, and right now there's really only one thing here to enable parallel sprints. If you were having other products such as Jira Service Desk, you would also have a section for Jira Service Desk configuration. And then you have other things like ability to link to other applications and so on. And then you've got your project settings, which lists out all the projects. You can access them through here as well, or you can go into the individual project settings. You can manage your project categories and things like that. And then issues. Now, we will be spending a good amount of time in this issue section of the Jira settings because this includes everything to do with issues, whether it is the types of issues, the workflows that they follow, screens that are displayed for issues, the fields that display on the screens, and many other features. So we'll be spending a good chunk of time in this section. And then lastly, we have apps, which is basically your third-party add-ons or plugins or whatever you want to call them. And so you can look for new apps through the Atlassian Marketplace, or you can manage any apps that you may already have installed. And that's it. So that's a quick summary and walkthrough of all your Jira settings that are available. Now let's head over to the site admin. So as I click on this, it's going to open up a new tab. And so now we are in the site administration, and you will notice that it looks like a completely different website. You don't have that Jira navigation bar at the top as we see here, because this is your Jira site. But this is where you would configure all the things about your site, whether it is users, groups, and then down here you can see the billing section. So if I were to come in here and click on billing, it's just going to take me right into this section over here. You can discover new applications. So this is where you can subscribe to other products like Service Desk or Confluence and so on. And then one more thing I wanted to point out is we talked about organization. So you can see here, if I click on back to organization, this level and these settings are basically the organization settings. The organization that was created is called Jira Course Cloud, which is the same as the Jira site. And so you can see right now there's only one site under this organization. And when you click on that, it's going to come down into the site administration. So don't get confused every time you come to this site administration and it looks different and you're wondering how you got here. It doesn't look like your normal Jira interface. Just remember that this is to configure all your products, not just Jira related stuff. But if you ever wanted to go back to Jira, you can also just scroll down here and under application settings, there's a link that will go back to Jira, which will basically just come back here. Okay. So that's a look at the admin settings that are available. We are going to start off with our site admin, because if you are setting up a brand new site for your team, one of the very first steps would be to invite your team members. So we will start by creating a user and then building off of that and talking about groups and then permissions and so on. So here we go. In this video, we will create a user. So right now in this instance, I just have two users to work with. The admin user that I've been using a lot and that I'm currently logged in as well as the developer user that does not have admin privileges. So in order to create or add a user, you actually have to invite that user to your instance. So you can either come in and type out a bunch of email addresses and select the invite team members button here, or you can scroll up to the top and click on Invite Users. Now you can invite multiple users at the same time, up to 10 separated by a comma as it mentions here. And let me give you a quick tip on creating aliases. If you're on your own just trying out Jira yourself and you want to create multiple users to test but don't have different emails, you can type out your email address. So let me just do an example here. Let's say your email address is test@email.com. So what you can do is right before the @ symbol, you can type out plus and then anything else you want. So for example, user1. And what that does is it will convert this into a unique alias, but all emails sent to test+user1@email.com will just end up going to test@email.com, your main email address. So it's just a means for you to create a bunch of different users with different email aliases, and you can have emails going to those users, but it will all just end up in your main inbox. Now guys, I am going to be using jiracourse@gmail.com because this is my email address that I'm using for the course. So I am creating an alias so that this email address can receive emails on behalf of the users that I am going to create. In the past, there have actually been several students who started using Jira course plus something at gmail.com to create users in their own instance. Now, that wouldn't be the way to go because those emails end up coming to me, and I've gotten bombarded by quite a lot in the past. So I kindly request you to not use Jira course at gmail.com. If your email is, joesmith@hotmail.com, then you should use joesmith plus test or something at hotmail.com so that you are the one that's getting those emails. Alrighty? Okay, so I am going to use Jira course plus AS to represent Adam Smith, who is going to be our product owner. So after I put in the email address, I can specify the role that Adam Smith will have. So the options available are either basic, which is just a basic user that's going to have access to Jira instance, or you can set him up as a trusted user. Now, a trusted user has slightly elevated privileges. So they can administer Jira and they'll have access to all the Jira settings, project settings, and things like that, but they won't have access to the site admin settings. And they are also not added to the Jira admin, the default Jira admin groups that Jira has. It's kind of like its own group on its own, the trusted user group, which is a subset of the Jira admin group. Don't let that confuse you too much. We will take a look at what the differences are between trusted and anything else. And of course, the third option is site administrator, which is just full on site admin privileges and access to all Jira settings and site admin and all that stuff. So for now, I'm just going to select basic user, and you have the option of unchecking Jira software. So you're creating the user, but you're not giving him access to software. Now, I would imagine if you're inviting a user, you want them to have access, so I'll leave that unchecked. Right away, you can add the user to various groups that are available, but I'll leave that blank. We'll do that, in future videos. You also have an option to specify that you can allow any accounts using this email domain. I, of course, do not want to enable that, but you do have the option. And you can also personalize the email invitation that gets sent as an email. So I'll just leave everything else as is, and I'll go ahead and invite Adam Smith. Okay, so the user is created, and you can see here that Adam Smith's name already got populated. And, I have a PO just to point out easily that this user is the product owner. And the reason his name automatically got populated is because his Atlassian account already exists with this email address. And I may have used his account in other Jira sites, so by me inviting him here just ends up using the exact same profile, and now he will have access to this instance as well. If you used an email address that did not already have an Atlassian account, you might not see a name, you would just see the email address listed here, and so that user would need to go in, log in, set up the Atlassian account with the name and all those other details. And only once that's done, then the name will appear here. Okay, so now we've added the user. Let's go into the user's details. Alright, so you can see that Adam Smith has access to the site and has access to Jira software. Below that, you can see the role that we assigned to Adam Smith. And then down here under groups, you can see Adam Smith was added to the Jira software users group. This group comes with Jira by default and is actually a default access group, meaning that any user who is given access to Jira automatically gets added into this group. So, for example, if I were to uncheck Jira software, basically signifying or representing that I'm revoking Adam Smith's access to this instance, and so you can see that the group disappeared from the bottom. And so if I enable that again, giving Adam Smith access, you can see that he automatically got added to the group again. So this just signifies that any user in this group basically has access to Jira and can log in. Speaking of logging in, at the top here, I can actually, as the administrator, I can log in on behalf of Adam Smith as if I would be impersonating Adam Smith. Now you can see that this button is grayed out because Adam Smith has never accessed the site. So for me to do this, I would need to step away. I'll pause this video and I'll actually log in as Adam Smith separately, and then I'll come back and I'll refresh this page. Okay, so now I am back. I have logged in as Adam Smith, and so now you can see that he has last seen the site on a certain date, and so I can also log in as Adam. But before I do that, I just want to point out some other administration functions that you as the admin could do. You could reset his password if he ever has, any login issues, or in fact for any user you can do this. And you have the ability to remove Adam Smith. So one thing to note about this is that Jira doesn't delete the user in the sense that all the activity also gets wiped out. Jira will kind of quote unquote deactivate that user. So if the user had made comments on issues or done any updates, all that audit trail or log or history of that activity will still remain, but the user will not count towards a license. So that's always a good thing to keep in mind. And so let's just go ahead and log in as Adam Smith. So now I am technically logged in as Adam Smith, and you can see here there's a pop-up that says I'm logged in as another user, and I have the ability to switch back to the admin account. But you can see here that Adam Smith has access to the projects. I can go in, let's just head into the sample Scrum project. He has access to the board, he can see the issues. Now if I come up here to the top and I click on the cogwheel, you can see that Adam is not an administrator and only has access to the personal settings. So that's because we had assigned the basic role. So let me just switch back, and if I just click somewhere else, I should get the pop-up again. There we go. So then I can click on switch back. And let's head back into Adam Smith's page. What I want to show you now is what the difference is between basic and trusted user. So I'll specify trusted. I'll wait for Jira to give me the confirmation. Okay, so now I can log in as him again. And now if I go up to the cogwheel, it might take a little bit of time to refresh. So I'm just going to refresh this again and let's try. Okay, there we go. So now you can see Adam Smith has access to all the Jira settings, but not the site admin stuff. So that is kind of what the trusted user entails, in that, they become a product admin. And let me revert back, switch back to the admin account. There it is. Okay, so if I come into Adam Smith's page again, you see the trusted user, but then he is still only a part of the Jira software users group. We will see in more detail, in the next video, that there are a lot of admin groups also, and when a user is part of those groups, they become a Jira administrator, but then Adam wasn't added to any of those groups, and that's what I was kind of implying by trusted user, is kind of its own group that does give the user access to the Jira product settings. Okay, so that is a look at how you can invite a user and the roles and things that you can do on behalf of the user as an administrator. Another thing that I wanted to talk about, since it's related to users joining your site, is the site access and access request pages. So let's head over to the site access page. So you can see up top here, these settings basically control how users get access to your site. So you as the admin have the ability to specify that users with a specific email domain can join with or without an invitation. By default, it is set to not approve any domain, but you can go ahead and you can allow any domain, which essentially means any user can sign up themselves to the Jira instance, or you can approve specific domains. So, any user that's part of your own company. So I'll just leave it as don't approve. And then notice this setting here that if you are approving certain domains, you can notify the site admin anytime a user does join. Another option here is user invites. So you can enable that existing users can send invitations to anyone. And that would be without admin approval. So just keep that in mind if that's something, if you want to spread out the Jira invitations across your entire company, you can have users be able to invite others, or especially, trusted users. And the last thing I want to show you here is invite links. So you can basically create an invite link and then just circulate this across your entire organization, so that anyone who receives it can basically click on it and then just self-sign up themselves. So it doesn't require the admin having to send out individual invitations to each user. This link can just be circulated and then everyone can just sign up on their own. So I just wanted to point out these additional features through which you can get users into your site. Also, just keep in mind that the URL, I believe, expires after 30 days. And so after 30 days, a new one would need to be regenerated. And the last thing I want to show you is that if a user does not have access to a particular product, they can request for access, and then any access requests would come in here, and then you as the administrator can go in and then you can approve or deny accordingly. So that's a general look at user creation and the different options that you have in terms of how accounts can be created, or I should say how users can be added to the Jira instance. Jira has added that flexibility where it doesn't have to rely on the admin, and depending on company policies, users could invite themselves and request access. Now let's continue and talk about groups and how we can create groups. In this video, we are going to be setting up a group. A group is basically a collection of users. And so, for example, if you want to configure permissions on anything within Jira for a group of people, rather than doing it individually for each person, it would obviously be better to create a group and add those users to the group and just configure the permissions for that group. So that is one of the many advantages of having groups in Jira, and some of the things that you can configure around groups are global permissions, or even specific access to projects, or even the overall access to the Jira application. So let's go ahead and create a group as an example, and let's see how we can give that group access to this instance. So I'm going to head over to my groups page. I'm still within the site admin, as you can see. Now here are some default groups that Jira creates for us. We've already taken a look at the Jira software users, and if you recall, I had mentioned that this is a default access group, which you can see through this lozenge over here. And just to restate again, any user that is given access to Jira automatically gets put into this group. Now we've got a couple of other groups here. So starting off with the site admin, this is fairly explanatory. Any user that is in this group gets the site admin privileges and access to this entire section that we're seeing here. Now up top, we've got Jira administrators and administrators. Both of them have access to the Jira administration, but not the site administration. Now, what is the difference between these two? Well, the Jira admin, as it suggests, gives you the administration rights within Jira, so the access to all the settings that we had seen. Whereas the administrators group gives you the administration rights within all applications that are installed under the instance. So say you have Confluence and Jira installed. If you are part of this administrators group, you can administer both of them. But if you are not in the administrators group, but you're in the Jira administrators group, then you can only administer Jira, but not Confluence. So you can say that Jira administrators is a subset of the administrators group. Okay, so these are the default groups that comes with Jira. Now let's go ahead and create our own custom group. So I'll come up to the top right here, click Create Group. So the example that I'm going to assume is that we have a group of external consultants, and we need to give them access to Jira. But because they are external consultants, we don't want them to be just like any other team member that's within the organization. So the first thing that we would do is create a separate group for them, and then we can start talking about how we configure their permissions to give them access to only the things that they need to see, unlike all other team members within the organization. So let's do that. I'm going to call it external consultants. You can put in a description if you want, and you can even specify to add the members in the next step, but I'll leave that for now and let's just create the group. Okay, so now we are in the groups page, and obviously there's no one added into it yet, and you can go up here to the top and you can add members, basically users that have already been set up in your instance. But what I need to do is actually create a new user who is going to be our consultant. So I'm going to go back to the users page, click on invite, and once again I will use my alias mechanism, and this user will be JP representing Jack Parker, who is going to be our consultant. So I want Jack Parker to get access to Jira for now. I'll leave all this as is. Let me click out of there and invite. Okay, so the user is created and you can see Jack Parker has now popped up. Once again, the name is being populated because an account already exists under this email address, so it's just taking in the name that's already been registered under that account. So let's go into Jack Parker's page. We can see that he has access to Jira software, and as expected, he was added into the Jira software users group. But this is not what we want, because this basically makes Jack exactly the same as any other team member. So what we are going to do is we will need to add him to the external consultants. So now we can see that option appearing here. So we'll add him to the group, and let's remove him from Jira software users. So now he's only a part of the external consultants group. Alright, so now let's try logging in as him, but as we can see once again, he hasn't ever logged into the site. So I'll need to do that separately and then I'll come back and try this. Okay, I went ahead and logged in as Jack Parker in a separate window, and let me just refresh this page. So as I refresh that page, you can see here now that Jira software is now disabled, as in Jack Parker does not have access to Jira software. So what I actually had to do to log in as him, I had to enable that again, log in as him, and then come back and disable it. So at least now you can see he's logged in and I can log in as the user. But as I do this, we will expect that Jack Parker is not going to have access to anything. As you can see here, can't access. If I try to do a search, I should not be able to see anything. So that confirms that Jack Parker doesn't really have any access. So let me switch back and let's go back to Jack Parker's page. So the next step is to give access to Jack Parker, but the way we will do that is not by giving him as an individual user access to Jira, but rather we're going to give the group access to Jira so that going forward, if we have additional consultants, we can just come in and add them to the group, and by association, they will get access to Jira. So giving application access is actually done through this product access page. So when we go here, this page tells you what groups have access to the various products. So right now we only have Jira software, but if you have other products such as Confluence or Jira Service Desk, they will show up here in their own respective sections. So here, coming up to the Jira software section, you can see that only these groups have access to Jira software. So if you add a user to any one of these groups, they will automatically be given access and they will consume a license in your subscription. If I come up here to the administration access tab, these are all the groups that have the Jira administration privileges. So if you once again put a user in any one of these groups, by default, they will be able to access the Jira settings. So now to come back here, in order to give a group access to Jira, we can just come up here, click on Add Group, and we'll pick the new one and select Add Groups. And so now external consultants should appear here. It may not be refreshing on its own, so let me just give it a kind nudge through the refresh button, and there you go. So now external consultants has access to this product. And we can confirm this if we go back to the users page and go to Jack Parker. Now you can see it's enabled. And even though he is not part of the Jira software users group, he now has access to Jira software. So let's go ahead and confirm that. So we'll log in as him again. And right away we can see the projects listed. Let me do another search for issues, and we hope that we can see the issues. There you go. I can click through and I can see the issue details. So it looks like the access is working, and we can switch back. So we now have access as a consultant, and the advantage here is that any user going forward that you add to the external consultants group, they are essentially part of a different group and not part of the standard Jira software users group, which all the other team members would be a part of. And now you can start going in and configuring individual settings and permissions for this consultants group as you see fit. So let's now start getting into permissions and talk about all the different levels of permissions starting in the next video. Now we're getting into Jira permissions and talking about the different levels of permissions that you can configure. So far, we've created some users, we've created a group, and we walked through how we can add users to groups. Now, it's up to us to go ahead and configure the correct permissions for the different groups, and basically, Jira breaks down these permissions into two main levels. You've got the global permissions, which apply to the overall application. And we'll take a look at some examples of global permissions that you can set. And then there are project-specific permissions, which apply only to each project. Some examples of these permissions are whether you can even access the project, or if you can create, edit, or delete issues, comment on issues, upload attachments, things like that. And for each project, these permissions can be given to different users or groups. So let's take a look at some examples of global permissions first. So here I am logged in as the administrator, and the global permissions can be found in Settings and under System, and then Global Permissions. So here's a list of the global permissions that Jira makes available. There's not that many, and just to give you just a couple of quick examples, the Browse Users and Groups permission. This is basically when you are searching for issues, say you want to filter by assignee, usually Jira would suggest all the users that you can assign the issue to, but if you don't have this permission, you wouldn't see any of the users. So basically, it doesn't let you browse any of the users or groups. Similarly, creating dashboards, or I guess shared dashboards and filters. So as a user, I can go ahead and I can do a search and I can save a filter for future use. Now, I also have the ability to share that filter with other users, but I can only do that if I have this global permission. And there are some other global permissions, but we'll take a look at them in more detail in the next video. Also, I just wanted to point out that here you can see the groups that have been assigned to each global permission, and looks like by default, Jira has added most of the groups in there. So you can see that Jira software users, for example, is already been granted most of these permissions, and you can see that the new group we created, which is external consultants, is not in any of them. So any of the users that we added in that consultants group wouldn't have any of these permissions, at least at the moment. So that was a quick look at global permissions. Now let's talk about project permissions. How would you be able to add groups to project permissions or assign project permissions to groups? So this is achieved through project permission schemes. So a group is given all the permissions to perform actions for a project through a permission scheme. And I'll show you an example, and it will seem a bit more clear once I show it to you, but just to give you the theory first. So once again, a project has a bunch of actions that you can perform on it, whether it's like creating an issue or editing or deleting issues, commenting, uploading attachments. All of these, and even just being able to browse and see the project on the project page, are all defined in a permission scheme. And that permission scheme then gets assigned to a project. In fact, you can assign it to multiple projects, but each project can only have one permission scheme. So now let's take a look at that. What I'm going to do is I will go back to projects under settings, and let's view all the projects. And we can take a look at the Jira course project, which I'll open up in a new tab. And you can see that I'm now under the project settings. And if I just click this back button over here, you'll see that we will be taken back to the project navigation page. And because I'm logged in as an administrator, I see the settings option at the bottom. So I can click on that and go back to the settings. And this is a list of all the various settings for a project, and we'll take a look at them later on. But I wanted to just focus on the permissions. So you can see here that this is the permission scheme that this Jira course project uses, and it is called the default software scheme. And you can see that these are all the permissions that I was talking about. So administering the project, being able to browse and even see the project, and then you've got issue-related permissions such as assigning issues, closing, creating, deleting, things like that. And then even here, you've got voters and watchers permissions, commenting permissions, whether you're able to delete comments, and then things around attachments and time tracking, so on and so forth. And on the right side, you can see the user group or project role. Now, project role is something that we'll take a look at very soon, but you can see the users and groups that each of these permissions are assigned to. So basically, this project uses this permission scheme, and you can create new permission schemes. You can create multiple permission schemes and assign them to different projects. So where do we do that? We would need to go into, actually, I'll just go back to the home page and go back to settings. And you can find all the permission schemes under Jira under issues, and then scroll down all the way to the bottom to permission schemes. So you can see here that that default software scheme is what we were looking at. And you can see that all the 3 projects that we have so far, all of them are actually using that same scheme. And this is something that Jira does by default. Any new project you create, whether it's Scrum-based or Kanban-based, at least all of them end up getting the default software scheme. And you can go in here and you can look at the permissions, and you will see that same screen that we had seen with all those permissions defined and who has those permissions. And of course, you can go back and you can create new permission schemes, which will once again contain a list of all those actions, but I can change who gets what permission and then assign that new scheme to another project. So just to summarize, you've got 2 kinds of permissions. Once again, the global permissions apply to the overall Jira application, something that you can do across Jira, whereas the project permissions can get pretty granular and define what users or groups can do within a given project. And all of that is defined in a permission scheme. Now, before we dive into the project permissions in more detail, in the next video, let's take a look at the global permissions in a little more detail, just so you can understand what each of them represent. Okay, so let's take a deeper dive and closer look into each of these global permissions, starting from the top. So administer Jira is self-explanatory. It is the global permission to administer Jira. And just looking at the users or groups that have been assigned to it, you can see the 3 main default admin groups that we have seen before. Now here, this trusted users, and you can ignore this huge alphanumeric number at the end of that. But this is basically the trusted users group that I was talking about. If you recall, it's almost like a subset of admin users, but anyone that is a trusted user does have access to the Jira settings, so can administer Jira. And then the 2 groups above that, you can also ignore them. They're basically built-in system groups. So I think system administrators is the role that Atlassian support staff would have to assume if they ever needed to log into your cloud instance to help you with something. And then this add-ons admin is basically something that is created for add-ons to just give the respective permissions that they need. So you can ignore these 2. But you can see the remaining expected admin groups. Now you can configure the groups that show up here by clicking on this link here, which is basically going to take you to the user management page. So I just opened that up in its own tab, and you can see it's taking us to the site admin under product access. So if we go to the administration access part of it, these are the 3 groups. So if you were to remove any one of them from here, they would also get removed from the global permission. So that's the Administer Jira global permission. Coming down here, we touched on this briefly in the last video, but this basically allows you to browse and see a list of all the users and groups within the site. So for example, and that is something you usually see in a user picker field. So assignee is an example as being a user picker field. So we can actually look at that as an example as well. Let me open up one of the filters that we created. So let me just go to View All Filters. And here, so this SSP Incomplete Stories, this is a filter that we had created in, I believe, the Working Within an Agile Team section of the course. So when I come into here, if I look at the assignee field or the assignee filter, I can see a list of suggested users. I can even find all the other users. So if I type out Adam, there he is. Same thing with Jack. So I'm able to see all the users available in this Jira site through this user picker field. Now we had noticed, I guess I need to go back to the global permissions. Let me just go back to System, Global Permissions. So as I was saying, we had noticed in the last video that external consultants is not in any one of these, so they would not have any of these global permissions. And I have Jack Parker logged in a separate window. And if you recall, Jack Parker is part of the consultants group. So what I'm going to do is I'll just go ahead and I'll go to the exact same filter. Now this time when I go to the assignee filter, you'll notice that it's not suggesting any users to me. All I can see is the current user, which is Jack Parker, the user that's logged in, or unassigned. And if I were to come in and type, Jira gives me some kind of error message. Now this is actually new. Normally it would, or at least in the past, it would just return no results, but I guess now it's starting to give me this error message, so I can just prevent that. And so now if I try anything, really it's not working. It's not able to find any of the users. So that is just the example of what that global permission represents. Okay, so coming down here to the next global permission, also we touched on this briefly, but the sharing of dashboards and filters is something that we have seen as well. So let me go back to the filter that I have open. If you recall, when we click on the details page, you're able to share it based on the permissions. Now, interestingly enough, this filter is actually owned by the developer user, and I am logged in as the admin. So hence, I am not able to edit the permissions because I am not the owner. So looks like I'll need to switch to a different filter. Maybe we can just use the filter that was created for the SSP board. So here, if I click on details, you can see it's owned by the administrator. So that's good. And I see the edit permissions link. And when I click on it, I can share it with whoever I want to. So that is the global permission that lets me share my filters, and the same thing would apply for dashboards. So once again now, if I come back to Jack Parker's window, if I click on details, so similarly, because Jack Parker is not the owner, we expect that the edit permissions link does not appear. So what we need to do is we need to create a filter that is actually owned by Jack Parker and see if that link shows up. So what I can do is I can actually save this again, and let me just call this Jack Parker's filter. Okay, so now we've got, it's the exact same filter settings, but it's just renamed and saved as a different name and a different filter. So now when I go to the details, you can see it's owned by Jack Parker, but the edit permission link is still missing. And that is because Jack Parker does not have that global permission to share filters and dashboards. So that is what that represents. Now coming down here, manage group filter subscriptions. Okay, so coming back to my filter that is owned by the administrator, I can create subscriptions. I can create it as a personal subscription for myself, or I can share it with other groups. Now, as an admin, I can see all the different groups that have been set up in this Jira site. So that's what the permission represents. Now, once again, coming back to Jack Parker's view, when I click on details, I see the new subscription option, but you'll notice that that drop-down is not available. So Jack Parker is not able to share this, is not able to create a subscription on behalf of other groups or for other groups. He can only do it as a personal subscription. And that is once again because he does not have the respective global permission, which is the Manage Group Filter Subscriptions global permission. And then moving on, we've got the Bulk Changes global permission. Okay, so coming back here, once again, still logged in as the administrator, I have a list of issues that are being returned by this filter. I can come in here to the top right through the ellipsis, and I see this option to bulk change all 27 issues. So when I click on it, it lists out all the issues, and I can either select all, or I can handpick and select a few, hit next, and then I have a bunch of options to edit all of them at the same time, move them to another project, transition them to a workflow, so on and so forth. And just to show you, for example purposes, if I click on edit, you will see a list of a whole bunch of different fields, all these fields that I can edit simultaneously for the issues that I selected. So I just wanted to show you what that looks like. I'll cancel out of this, but that is essentially the bulk edit permission. Now coming back to Jack Parker's instance, we're still looking at the filter we created by him. Now if I come up to the top right, you'll see no available options. And that is because Jack Parker doesn't have that global permission. And then the last global permission we have is the Create Next Gen Projects. We had seen this before, and we had talked about it being available to pretty much anyone, any user that's logged in. So this is actually one that we expect Jack Parker is able to do. So now I'm looking at Jack Parker's view. If I try to create a project, I can see the classic one, the classic version is grayed out, but I am actually able to select a next gen and create a next gen project. So that checks out as expected. Okay, so we have seen that the external consultant does not have any of these global permissions. How would you go about giving them the permissions? So when you scroll down to the bottom of this page, the global permissions page, you can see here that you can select whatever option you want, and administer Jira is not available because again we had seen that's something you do in the site administration section. But you can select any one of these other permissions, and then you can come in and then you can add the external consultants group or any other group that you create accordingly, and then assign the global permission one by one. So that is a walkthrough and summary of global permissions. There's not that many in here, and I guess any user that has been added to Jira and is part of the default Jira software users group will get all the permissions by default. But you just have to be careful when you start creating new groups and taking users out of that default access group to remember that if these permissions are something you'd want them to have, to then come in and add that group respectively. Okay, we've taken a look at users, groups, and permission levels. And we identified the two permission levels as global permissions, and we saw some examples of the global permissions that Jira has. And we've also taken a look at how project permissions are assigned. And basically they're assigned through a permission scheme which defines all the different actions that can be taken or performed on the project, and you're able to give each of those permissions to individual users or groups within that permission scheme, and then you can assign that permission scheme to a project. Now let's take a look at an example over here. So let's say you have user A who has the ability or should be given the ability to create issues in project A only, and user B should be able to create issues in project B only. How would you go about setting this up in Jira? Well, so first thing is that you would need to create two permission schemes. And so for example, in the first permission scheme, for the create issue action, you would assign user A to that action, and for permission scheme 2, you would assign user B to the create issue action. And then you would assign permission scheme 1 to project A, and then permission scheme 2 to project B. So because you have two different users that are supposed to have the exact same responsibility in two different projects, you have to create two different permission schemes. What if you have a third project and either user A or user B can create an issue in that third project? Well, then you aren't able to use any of these existing permission schemes because each of these only allows one of the users. So if you want to have another project where both these users can create issues, then you obviously have to create a third permission scheme, and you can assign both user A and user B to the create issue action, and then that permission scheme you would assign to the third project. So you can see how unmanageable this can become if you have a lot of users within your team, and if you want to delegate responsibility for various actions, and if you want to get just even a little more granular, this starts to become pretty unmanageable. So Jira introduced something called project roles, and that pretty much solves the issue. And the way that works is you can define project roles across Jira. So it's kind of at the level of global permissions in the sense that it applies to all of Jira. So you can go in and you can configure project roles, and every single project that you create will have access to these roles. They'll basically end up having all these roles within every single project that you create. And then you can take users and assign them to the project roles. And instead of assigning the users to the permission actions, you would assign the project roles to the permission actions. And I know that this probably sounded a bit confusing, so I'm going to try to lay it out and walk through it step by step. But just so you get a sense of what I'm talking about, let's see where you can set up your project roles. So from the home page, if you head back to the System settings, you can find your project roles under the Security section here. So when you click on it, this is the project roles that currently exist in your Jira site. And you can define new project roles here as well. And don't get confused by administrators over here. This does not represent or is not the same thing as the administrators group that we have seen already. This is more so a project role that represents administrators within a project only, not the overall Jira site. And like I said, you can create your own project roles. So if you have a QA role, you can create that here. You can even create like a project manager project role. And then once you create any role, that role will be available in every single project. And you can assign people or groups to that role. And I'll show you where you can do that in just a second. One thing I want to point out is you can see here under the actions, you can see where the project role is being used. Are there any default members? So what that means is anytime you create a new project, every project has these project roles. But then anyone you specify as a default member will automatically get assigned that project role as part of any new project that you create. Okay, so where would you assign users or groups to the project roles in a specific project? So let's head over to one of the projects. So maybe we can take a look at the Jira course project as an example. And we would need to go into the project settings. And you will find the project roles in the people section. So right now, by default, nobody has really been assigned any specific or assigned to any specific project role, but you can go in, you can first see all the roles that are available. So right now it's just the two that we know of, and we haven't created any custom ones yet, but you can come in here and you can say, you want the product owner, so who's Adam Smith, and you can assign him, one of these roles. If you want him to be the administrator of the product, you can do so here. I'm not going to do this now because we will be taking a look at this through an example in just a bit, but I just wanted to show you where you configure the project roles that, that cover the entire Jira instance, and all projects would get that project role, and then within the project, how you would assign people to the project role. So first, let me explain again what I just talked about. A project role is defined in Jira, and so you could take this project role as an example. Once it's defined, project A as well as project B will have this project role. Now you can assign users or groups to the project role, and what happens is that this project role then gets added to permission schemes. So instead of adding users or groups straight into permission schemes, you first add them to the project role for each of these projects, and then the project role is added to the permission scheme, and then of course the permission scheme gets assigned back to the project. So this is how the flow would work. Now maybe let's use the example and try to understand this a little more. So going back to this example of user A only being able to create an issue in project A and user B only being able to create a issue in project B, how would we solve that with project roles? Well, what would happen is we would create a project role called issue creator in Jira. The moment you create that project role in Jira, both project A and project B will now have that project role. And what we'll do is, for the create issue action, we're going to create only one permission scheme. We don't need two. We're only going to create one permission scheme. And for the create issue action, we're going to assign the issue creator project role to that action. And then obviously we'll assign that same permission back to both projects. But what is the difference? The difference is that for project A, we're only going to give user A that project role, that issue creator project role. And for project B, we're only going to give user B that project role. So basically user A will have the issue creator project role, which has the create issue permission, and that is assigned to project A. So hence user A gets to create issues in project A. Similarly, user B has the issue creator project role in B, which is assigned to the create issue permission, which in turn comes back to project B, and so hence user B can create issues in project B. And that's kind of how it works. So going back to this example that we ended with one of the lectures previously, the only difference here really is that in between groups and permission scheme, you add a project role, which is described here. So you're going to add groups or even users to the project role. The project role gets assigned to the permission schemes. The permission schemes get assigned to the projects, and every single project in turn has their own project role. So let's actually go through this in my Jira instance so that you can see it as an example, and we're going to do this in the next video. In this video, I would like to ask you to get in some practice with Jira yourself. I want you to try and set this entire diagram up in your instance. We talked in theory about project roles and how they get assigned project permissions through the permission scheme. So I would like to ask you, especially if you have your own Jira instance to play around with, to go ahead and for two different projects, give two different users the permission to create issues in each of the projects. If you don't already have two users, go ahead and create them. Then create the project role, assign one of the users to that role for one of the projects, and the second user the same role in the other project. Then go ahead and update your permission scheme that is used by both the projects and grant the create issue permission to that project role. Then try it out, test it out. Log in as the first user and ensure that you can only create issues in the first project. Then log in as the second user and ensure you can only create issues in the second project. So feel free to pause this video right now and take a stab at it, because practicing will only get you more used to working with users and permissions. I will be demonstrating how to do all this, so feel free to pause the video, try it yourself, and then can follow along once you've tried it yourself. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is create the project role. So I'll head over to the system settings and find project role section, and we will go ahead and let us call this issue creator project role. Now you can also go in and put in a description if you'd like, and then click on add project role. Okay, so now the project role has been created, and every project in Jira will have this new project role available for you to start assigning users or groups to. So now let's head over to our projects, and maybe we will pick the sample Kanban project and the sample Scrum project. And the two users that I'll use will probably just be Adam Smith and the KS developer user. Okay, so what I'm going to do is let me open up the project settings for each of the projects in their own tabs. And we will go into the sample Kanban project first. We will go to people. And let's say that only Adam Smith should be allowed to create issues in this project. Now you can see here that the admin user was automatically given the developer's project role. Now I'm not sure what caused this to happen. Maybe it's just something that Atlassian has in the code that, whenever you create a sample project with sample data, it ends up putting the user that created it into the developer's project role, even though I don't believe the permission scheme is really using this project role. But anyway, for our purpose, we will click on Add People, and then let's look for Adam Smith. And we will give Adam the Issue Creator project role. Now you can see it appearing here. Okay, that's it. And then let's head over to our sample Scrum project. Same thing, go to People, click on Add People, and then let's look for the KS developer account and assign the same project role. And that's it. So what do we have next? We've created the issue creator project role. We have the two users and the two projects. We've assigned them to the project role in each project respectively. The next step would be to update the permission scheme and make sure the create issue permission is given to the new project role. So I can go ahead and I can close these tabs. And once again, the permission scheme can be found under the issues part of your Jira settings. So we'll head over there, scroll all the way down, and go to permission schemes. Now, technically, you could have gone into the project settings and found the permission scheme there, but it would have basically just taken you back to the main Jira settings page. And here, you can see that both the Kanban and the Scrum projects are using the exact same permission scheme. So all we need to do is just update this one scheme and it will affect both projects, which is what we want. But also keep in mind that it's going to also affect the Jira course project. So just be wary of any other project that also uses a permission scheme whenever you are going ahead and updating it. So let's go into the permissions. And modifying this permission scheme is actually something we are doing for the first time in this course. So if you were able to do this yourself and figure it out, good on you. But if not, no worries, that's why we're here. So I'm going to scroll down and find the create issues permission. And you can see right now it is assigned to pretty much any logged in user. And once again, you can ignore this. This is just built in. It's a default project role that Atlassian uses behind the scenes. Not something we need to worry about. But the first thing we need to do is make sure that not every single logged in user has that permission to create issues. So I'll click on remove and I'll select that option and hit remove. Okay, so technically now nobody can create issues in any of the projects that use this permission scheme. So let's go in now and click edit, and we want to add the project role of issue creator and grant that permission. And that should be it. So the next step now is for us to test this out. So once again, Adam Smith should only be able to create issues in the Kanban project, and the KS developer only create issues in the sample Scrum project. So I'll head over to the user management section because we will log in on behalf of those users. Okay, let's try Adam first. Okay, we will log in as Adam. Okay, so now that we're logged in as Adam, when I hit the create button, so here in the drop down, we can only see sample Kanban. We do not see sample Scrum. Of course, there are other projects in the instance that haven't been affected, but this is the one that we expected to see. All right, so that's good so far. Let's switch back and now log in as the KS developer. We'll come down and find the respective user. Let's log in. So here we expect to see only the sample Scrum project and not the Kanban. And there you go, so I can see sample Scrum, and I do not see Kanban, so there you go, it works. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but even for Adam Smith, and as well as this user, since we're seeing this user right now, we do not see the Jira course project appearing either. And if you recall, if I switch back, and in fact we can come back to the permission page, and if I actually go back to the permission schemes page, even Jira course is using that permission scheme, but we never assigned any user that issue creator project role. So pretty much nobody has the permission right now to create issues in this project. So that is why it wasn't appearing for either of the users. Now, what if me, logged in as the administrator, tried to create an issue? What do you think the administrator should see? Let's try it out. So if I hit create, none of the projects are appearing. And that's because this admin user currently does not have that permission because the user wasn't assigned to that project role. And that project role is the only thing that has the permission to create issues in these projects. So until we assign the admin user to that project role, you can't create any issues. So hence you kind of have to be a little careful in terms of how you organize your permission scheme and project roles. If you have some permissions assigned to project roles, then you want to make sure that all your projects have that particular project role assigned to the relevant users or groups. You can always just keep things open and allow any logged in user to be able to have all these permissions like we saw here. In fact, most of the permissions here, it's just kept wide open where any logged in user has these permissions. But you do have the option of making things more granular if you want to keep a tight security on things and have only specific people being able to do specific functions. Now, I also want to mention some more advantages of project roles, because before I introduced project roles, I mentioned that you could add groups to permission schemes, and that's something you can still do, but given the example I just walked through, if you want to get more granular and you've got multiple users that need to do the same function in different projects, using groups for that can become unmanageable. And so you can use the project roles to take advantage and bring about that functionality easily that is still easy to manage. Now, the other advantage of project roles over groups is that only Jira admins can add users to groups, whereas for project roles, the project admin is able to do that because the project roles are already defined in Jira. It's just a matter of specifying who gets what project role for each project, and that's something the project administrator can do. So hopefully that made sense. I think we've covered a lot of ground so far in the admin section in terms of users, groups, permissions, project roles, and how you can assign permissions to any one of these. And hopefully you were able to get some practice from that exercise. In fact, we'll be going into another bigger exercise that brings all this admin stuff we've seen so far come together. In this next exercise, we are going to look at another example and see how users, groups, project roles, and permission schemes can all come together by taking on a scenario that somewhat mimics a real-world scenario. You may find yourself needing to set up similar kinds of permissions for your own team within your organization, but if not, hopefully the example will go through enough to give you a better idea of these features and how you can use them, and hopefully allow you to set up the permissions for your own team based on your own specific requirements. So what are the objectives of this example? First, we're going to start off with a new project, and we'll call it the permissions example project. We're going to create a consultant user, and this user should only have access to this new permission example project that we'll be creating, and no other projects in your instance. That same consultant user should also have the ability to work on issues in that project. So if you look at a consultant, for example, your team may hire a consultant to help with a particular project. That may be the only project that that consultant should be able to see, And obviously you want that consultant to be able to work on issues. So that's kind of the user that we'll be creating and the kind of access that we'll be giving. The next user that we would be creating is a customer user. And this user, similar to the consultant, should only have access to that project alone and no other projects in the instance, but this customer user should have read-only access because being the customer, they're not necessarily going to be working on issues, but rather they should be able to access it and kind of monitor and view the progress and things like that. Then we're going to create a project owner user, and this user will be able to administer the project and is the only one who can manage sprints. And then finally, we'll also have a developer user that can work on issues. Now, this text file is something that I will be providing as resource for this video, so you can also refer to these steps and try implementing them yourself. Now, what I'm going to do is I have another text file open here, and what I'm going to do is I will be listing out the solution steps that I will be following. But what I would suggest is that you pause this video right now and think through these objectives that I've written out and what are all the steps that you would need to do in Jira to implement these objectives. And once you've got something written down, you can resume this video and see how they compare to the steps that I'll be going through. So go ahead, feel free to pause the video right now and then resume once you have something written down. Okay, so what are the solution steps that I will be implementing? The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create the users that I need. And so obviously I'll need to create a consultant user, the customer user, the project owner, and developer user. I may already have some users that I could use for this, but if you don't in your own instance, then feel free to create the respective users. The second step that I'll have to do is I'll have to create the corresponding groups. And the groups I'm going to create are consultant and customer. And the project owner, I don't necessarily need to create a group because it's specific to this project. And so I will just treat that as an individual user. You can even create a developer group, but I may not because I'm just going to use the already default Jira software users group that Jira already created for me. Now you may go ahead and create a developer user group if you would like. That's not a problem. I may decide to do that as well, but for now I'll just leave that as is, just keeping the two new consultant and customer groups for now. The next step would be to create the project roles based on the users and groups that are created. Now, what are the project roles that I'm going to create? I'll obviously need a consultant. Now, an interesting thing about the consultant is that you'll notice that the consultant and the developer are kind of similar in that they both will be able to work on issues, and obviously both are going to be able to access the project. So you may get away without needing that consultant project role, and you could just use the developer project role. But going forward, I think in any organization, you would want the consultant to be separate because it's usually an external party and you may not have the same kind of privileges that a developer might have. So I'm going to treat that as a separate project role for now. So we'll have the consultant and developer project role. We'll definitely want a customer project role because obviously their permissions are going to be different in the sense that they only have read-only access. And then finally, we have a project owner who will obviously be given the permission to manage sprints. Hence, we need a separate project role for that. And as we go about the example in the subsequent videos, we'll see if we need any other project role. We'll see if any other project role makes sense to have. So what would be the next step after that? So now that we have the users, groups, and project roles, we will need to create a new permission scheme for the project and assign the individual permissions, and I guess I should be specific, the project permissions to the respective project roles that were just created in the previous step. And then once the new permission scheme has been created, I guess I can now go ahead and create the new project. Now, the reason I'm creating this project after having created the users, groups, and the project roles is because by default, if I were to add any users or groups to a project role, by default, only new projects that are created after that will automatically get those default users assigned to those project roles. All the existing projects that have been created from before will not get those default users. So what I mean by that is, for example, if I were to create the developer project role and I have a developer group and I assign that developer group to the project role by default, then what happens is when I create the new project after all that is done, it will automatically have that developers group assigned to the developer project role. But if I had created the project before all these steps, then it wouldn't have that done by default. I would need to go in and manually assign the developer group to that developer project role. Hope that makes sense. It'll hopefully be more clear once we go through the example. So once I've created the project, then I need to update the project to use the new permission scheme that we created. Then once the permission scheme has been updated for that right project, we will need to assign the respective users and groups to each of the project roles for that project. And then finally, let's test everything out. Let's log in as each user and make sure everything's configured correctly. So just to go through these steps a little quickly here, we're going to create the users and then the groups. We're going to create the project roles. We'll create a new permission scheme and we'll set up the respective permissions and give them to the respective project roles. Then we'll create the new project, and then we'll update the project to use the new permission scheme that we just created, and then we'll assign the respective users and groups to each of the project roles for that project, and then we'll test everything out. So if the steps that you wrote out aren't exactly similar, well, it doesn't really matter because there's no right way of going about this. There's multiple ways you could do this. It's just a matter of going in and trying it. So what I'm going to do now is let's move on to the next video, and I will actually go about implementing each of these steps. And I would definitely recommend that you take a stab at it first before looking at the video, as that'll give you that practice. And if you run into any roadblocks, that practice will help you understand these concepts and this functionality a lot more when you see the video after. Okay, so as we go through this exercise, I'm going to have the exercise objectives as well as the solution steps open on the side, just so we can reference them easily. Alright, so the first step is to create our users. So we're going to, whoops, accidental click there. Let's just head over to our user management. And let's see here. So we need a consultant, customer, project owner, and developer. So we could probably use some of the users we already have. I will probably just use one in each of the categories. So the consultant we have is Jack Parker. The customer we will need to create. The project owner, we will use Adam Smith. As you can tell, he's got the PO right beside his name to represent that. And the developer, we will use the KS developer account. So really, we only need to make one user, which is the customer. So I can just come in and type out the address, and we will be calling her Monica Hall. So let me just add her on here. Now, once again, guys, just as a friendly reminder, please do not use Jira course or +anything@gmail.com. Please be sure to use your own email address so you guys are the one that's getting the emails when you're testing and playing around with your own instance. Okay, so let's go ahead and invite Monica, and she should show up with her name already populated. There she is. Okay, so let's go into her page. And alright, so she's set up as a basic user. That's great. However, as we expected, she is added into the default Jira software users group, but she is going to be the customer. So we do not want her to be just like every other team member internal to the company. So let's go ahead and remove her from this group. And in terms of at least creating the users, that's all we need to do. we will need to add her into a group called customer. So that brings us to the second step. So let's take a look at our groups now. So we'll head over to the group section of the site administration. And so we already have our consultants group. And so we will need to create a customer group. And now I know I said in the last video that I may not create a group for the developers, but to be honest, when you think about it, it does make sense to have that, because chances are not all the users in your company are developers. So essentially not everyone in the Jira software users group are developers. The developers are probably very likely going to be their own group represented by, a subset of users within the organization. So it does make sense to represent them separately through a separate group. So I will be creating a developer group as well. Okay, so let's do that. So I come up here and click on create group, and the first one I will call customer. And I could choose to add members in the next step, and we will need to do that for Monica. So let's select this and create the group, and let's go ahead and pick Monica, and that's it for now. Okay, so perfect. So Monica is in the customer group. Let's go back, and now let's create our developers group. Okay, similarly, we will need to add the KS developer for now. We'll just go with one user in this group for now. And that's pretty much it. What else do we have to do? I believe that's it. So we have our users, we have our groups. The next step, actually, before we move on to the next step, there is one thing that we should check. And hopefully you guys remember to do so as well. I'm sure we would have discovered this, and you as well, when you went about your testing. But what we need to do now, let's actually go back to groups. Let's take a look at Monica's page. She still does not have access to Jira. That's because, well, okay, first of all, her group should show up. Let me just refresh this. Okay, yeah, I'm not sure why it didn't show up the first time, but yeah, okay, just confirming that Monica is in the group, but she still doesn't have access to Jira software. That's because this group hasn't been granted access to Jira software. So we do need to remember to go to product access, and just like we did for the external consultants, we need to come in and also grant access to the customer group. We do not need to worry about developers because, once again, the developers is a subset of everyone in the organization, which is basically Jira Software Users Group. So by default, that KS developer account is already part of this, hence that account already has access to Jira. Okay. So did I go ahead and add that? Let me just refresh. Okay, perfect. So customer is in there. Now if we go back to Monica's page, she should have access. Perfect. Okay. So now we have taken care of step 1 and step 2. Let's move on to step 3, where we will create the project roles that we need. So I can actually close this and get out of the site administration section. So now we're back in Jira, and let's head over to our settings, go to system, and get to the project roles. Okay, so these are the roles that we have so far. Now I am going to delete this because I created this just for example purposes. I don't intend on using this going forward. So let me just delete this issue creator project role. So here it just tells me what projects it's associated with. So even though these two projects are using it, we will be updating the permission scheme in just a bit. So, all of this is a moot point right now. Let me just go ahead and delete. Okay. So starting off, I want to take a look at the administrator's project role and just look at the default members here. So right now there are no default users and there are no default groups, but I believe it might make sense, and this is not something that you have to do, but it's optional, and I think it makes sense to always have your Jira administrators also be the administrator of any project that's in your instance. Because sometimes one user may not be as well versed with Jira. So if you set your project owner to be the administrator, he or she still might need help from the actual Jira administrator that knows what's going on. So by default, let me go ahead and specify that the Jira administrators, now for some, I guess this doesn't really suggest the group name to me, but if I come and click on this little group picker icon, it'll give me a pop-up window where I can now go and select the group. And let's click add. Okay, so let's go back to viewing the project role page. And so now under default groups, we have Jira administrators. So what this means is that going forward, any new project that we create will automatically have this group assigned to the administrator's project role. It's not going to update for the projects we've already created. So that is something you still have to go in and manually set, but any new project will have that set by default. Okay, all right, let's go back to the project role page. A similar thing is what we can do for developers, especially if you have one development team that works on all development projects, then it makes sense to go in and do the same thing and add that group as the default member of the developer's project role. So let's find the developers group, add, and perfect. So now the developers group is also a default member and will get assigned to the developer's project role for any new project that we create going forward. Okay, so now that we've managed the existing project roles, let's go ahead and create the ones that we need. So we need a consultant. We already have the developer. We need a customer and a project owner. So let's do that. So I'll start with the consultant. Once again, you can go in and put in a description of the project role if you want. Always recommend to do so, but I'm just going to do this quickly. So we want customer, and finally the project owner. Okay. Now, I'm not going to add any default members into any of these new roles, the consultant, customer, and project owner, because chances are you're going to have a different project owner for different projects. And I mean, if the same thing applies for customer and consultant, then you don't want to put a default member, and you can assign specifically for each project. Okay, so I believe that should take care of step 3. Moving on to step 4, we now need to create and work on our permission scheme. So for that, we are in the system section. Permission schemes you can find in the issues section. And this is something you will get used to and more familiar with as you use Jira more and more, where all these things live. So the permission schemes is all the way at the bottom. And we have seen this a couple of times already. The default software scheme is what is used by all the projects that we've been creating so far. The first project we created, since I created this Jira instance, that has its own scheme. We're not going to be looking at that. Let's focus on this one and take a look at how the permissions are laid out. Okay, so we can see here that pretty much all the permissions that are listed here have been assigned to any logged in user. So what that means is that any user that is able to log into this Jira instance can do all these things. So they can close issues. In this one, deleting issues looks like it's restricted to only the administrators. So that's something that any user won't be able to just come in and delete issues in these projects. But otherwise, for the most part, you can see that any logged in user can do these things. And this is where we want to come in and be a little more restrictive. So let's see what we can do here. I will just click on the back button so we can go back to the permission schemes page. Now, I'm not going to modify this. I will keep the default software scheme as is. What we can actually do is we can create a copy of it and then build off of that. However, one thing I do want to point out is, let me go back into there. I'll open that up in a new tab. It might actually be more work for me to copy this and then modify the copy as opposed to just creating a new permission scheme from scratch. And the reason for that is, if I were to copy this, then this is basically what I would get, and I would need to come into each permission and click on remove, and then remove the any logged in user, and then click edit, and then add the project roles that I want. So instead of doing that and clicking remove and then edit and remove and edit, I'm better off just starting off on a completely blank slate and then just adding the project roles from scratch. So that's what I'm going to do instead. So I'll come back and I will click on Add Permission Scheme. And let's say that this is going to be our main software permission scheme that we will be using going forward for any software project that we create. All right, so let's click Add. And so there we have it, the main software permission scheme. You can see it's not being used by any projects yet. That's because we just created it. And now if I go into the permissions, we're starting off on a complete blank slate. Okay, so let's just touch on this a little bit before we take a break, and we'll continue in the following video. But I do want to at least start this process and talk about this. So starting off with the administer projects, so that permission we would want to give to the administrator's project role. And again, you have many options to select here, but it is best practice to use project roles as we have already discussed. So I'll assign that to the administrator's project role. And the browse projects, now there is a little description below each permission. So browse project basically means that any user who has this permission will be able to even access this project. So it is the main permission to let anyone even access and view all the issues in the project. So it is really important. And so pretty much anyone in the team needs to be able to get this permission. So I can come in here and click Edit, select project role again, and so it's going to be the administrators, the consultant, customer, developers, project owner. All these roles, all the people that will take on these roles should be able to access the project. So now this makes me realize something. Instead of going through, and sorry, just a caveat that, just like the browse projects permission, a lot of these permissions, it would make sense to be assigned to everyone in the team. So instead of clicking on each permission, clicking edit, and then adding each project role one at a time, I think it makes sense to create a new project role and call it the project team. And basically anyone that's involved with that project will get added to that project team project role. So let's do that actually. So I'm going to come back here to the system section, which I'll open up in a new tab, go to project roles, and let me just come in here and create a project team project role. Click add. Okay, so we have that in there. Now let me close this and come back here, and I will have saved myself so many steps, because now for the browse project permission I can just come in, select project team, and that's it. And then we will worry later on who is going to be taking on that project team project role, like who is essentially in the project team. Okay, so moving on, the managed sprints. Let's take a look at our objectives. We see here that the project owner is the only one who can manage sprints. So I can come in here, click edit, and this one I would actually want to assign to just the project owner. Now, while I was reading that, I noticed the project owner can also administer the project. So the project owner may not be the administrators, may not be given the administrator's project role. So let's make sure that we also give the administer projects permission to the project owner. Okay, now view development tools. So this allows users in the project to view the development related information, such as code commits and reviews and things like that. So because this is more technical, you could choose to assign this to only the consultant and the developers. And the reason I say that is because developer can work on issues, but the consultant can also work on issues. So you could choose to do that, but you know, there could be chances where the customer or even the project owner might be technical as well, and they may want to see that information. So there's nothing wrong with assigning this to the project team, and that's what I will do. Viewing the read-only workflow, yep, sure, why not? Let's have everyone see that. There's no reason to restrict that. Okay, assignable user. So users with this permission may be assigned. So would it make sense to allow you to assign this issue to anyone? I think so. So let's just select project team. Assign issues, the ability to assign an issue to someone else, once again, makes sense the project team should have that. So you're starting to see a trend here. And it looks like a lot of these permissions should go to everyone that's involved with the project, basically the project team project role. So what I'm going to do is I am going to now stop this video, and I will go ahead and offline I will populate all these permissions, and let's resume in the next video and I'll go over everything that I've done. Okay, I've gone ahead and assigned all the permissions accordingly. Now, the advantage of setting up your permission scheme like this is that you should only have to do it once, and then similar projects can use the same scheme going forward. You would just have to specify for each of those projects who is going to be assigned to each of these project roles. And remember that if you think that you'll be assigning the same user or group to a project role for every project, then it makes sense to add them as a default member of that project role, as we had seen in the previous video. So now, just quickly going through the list here, you can see that most of the permissions ended up going to the project team. And that kind of makes sense because a lot of these permissions have to do with working on issues and modifying various issues or things about the issue. So, editing issue by itself goes to the project team. Linking issues to one another, transitioning issues to through the workflow, all make sense to go to the project team. However, some of the higher level and more specific functions, it makes sense to keep a little restricted to the project owner. So for example, setting the security, moving an issue to another project, or being able to modify the reporter, things like that. Even deleting issues, you could assign to just the project owner. So not everyone in the team is going in and deleting issues and doing some of the more restrictive functions. And so coming down here, voting. So it makes sense to have that again to the project team because you want people to manage watchers and add and remove themselves accordingly. Commenting is a similar kind of idea. Being able to add comments and deleting and editing your own comments should be allowed. Everyone should be allowed to do that. But things like deleting all the comments and editing all the comments should only go to the project owner. Same thing with attachments. We want to restrict deleting all attachments only to the project owner. Everything else can go to the team. And then the same thing for time tracking. So it's fairly straightforward and it looks really simple. It's kind of just broken down to between, should everyone get this permission or should it be a little more restricted? Okay, so we have finished step 4. We've created our new permission scheme. The next step would be to create a new project. Now, one thing is that we are going to have to test all this stuff out. And that involves things like working on issues, editing issues. So it would be nice for our project to have sample data to play with. But when I come up to here and I try to create a project, at least as of this recording, there's no option here for me to create a project with sample data. However, we have seen earlier in the course that we can create a board with sample data. And every time you create a board, it creates a project because a board has to be associated with a project. So what I'm going to do is I will actually create a board. So let's click on Create Board, and let's just go with Scrum, and I'm going to select this option here, Create a Scrum Board with Sample Data, and now you can see it's inquiring about the new project that it's going to create. So I'll specify what the project name is going to be. So let's call this permissions example project, and I can just update the key to match the initials of the name, and everything's good. So you can see it's going to create the project. Even though we're clicking create board, we know the project will get created as well. All right, perfect. So we are now in the permissions example project, and we are looking at the board that was created for it, and all this is sample data. So great, we've created our project. Now we need to update the project to use the new permission scheme. So we would need to do that in the project settings. Now I am logged in as the administrator, so I have access to the project settings. And this is something that we will see throughout this section, this whole project admin navigation. And the permissions is something down here. So we can find the permissions set up for this project. And you can see that it is using the default software scheme, where those permissions are assigned to any logged in user. So we don't want to use this scheme. We want to use the new one that we created. So we can come in here up to Actions and say use a different scheme. And then from the drop-down, we will find the main software permission scheme that we just created and associate that with the project. All right, so now we're still in the project settings and we can see it's using the main software scheme we created, and all the permissions looks like they're updated and assigned to the way we just configured it. Okay, so just like that, we've completed step 6. So we're almost at the home stretch now. The next step would be to assign the respective users and groups to each of the project roles for that project. So the project roles in the project are specified in the People section of the project settings. So when I click on People, so this lists out all the users and groups and the respective project roles that they have. And because, if you recall, we had added the developers group to the developers project role and the Jira administrators group to the administrators project role, you can see that as we created this project, those groups got assigned to the respective project roles automatically. Now, I think I had mentioned this before. For some reason, when we create sample data or a sample project with sample data, Jira adds the admin user to the developer role, but we don't really need this, so I will click on remove. And all right, so now we need to add the remaining users and groups and update the remaining roles. So what I'm going to do is I will actually open up the permissions in a separate tab, and let's see what other project roles we need to fill. So we've taken care of administrators. We need to do the project owner because the project owner has a lot of responsibility here. And we said that we wanted Adam Smith to be the project owner. So we'll click on Add People. Let's look for Adam and assign him to the project owner project role. And that's it. That's all we needed to do. Really simple. And the next step, another big role, is the project team. So this time we will have to add a bunch of people and groups to that project team project role. So it will of course have to be Adam. As the project owner, you are going to be part of the team. And then we want to add the consultants and the developers. So here we have a group. So let's just use the group. Now, again, keep in mind if you have specific or different users that will act as developers for a project, then you can go and individually add those users in. For now, I'm just going to add the group as a whole. And then for the consultants, we have a group as well. So I'll add the consultants because they will be working on issues, so they are part of the team. Click Add, and that's it. Now, what about customers? Coming back to the permission scheme here, you'll notice that we haven't really added customers to any one of these permissions. So let's look at our objectives. For a customer, the customer user should only have access to this project alone and no other projects in your instance. Okay, and this user should have read-only access. So right off the bat, given that the customer project role doesn't have any of this permissions, so by default, the customer has read-only access. They're not able to edit or modify or do anything, but they should be able to access the project. So accessing the project is governed by the Browse Projects project role, the Browse Projects permission. So we need to add the customer project role to this permission. So what I can do is I need to modify this permission scheme. I can come up here under Actions and click on Edit Permissions. And you'll notice right now we are in the project settings. So when I click on Edit Permissions, it's actually going to take us out of the project settings. We are now back in the Issues section of the Jira settings, and we're actually in the permission schemes, looking at the scheme again, so we can edit it. So here I'll come into the Browse Projects permission, click Edit, and let us add the customer project role. Okay, and that's all we need to do, and then we can go back to the project under the people section, and we can click add people, and then let's look for the customer group and assign that to the customer project role. And I believe that is it. Assign the respective users. Okay, so we have done that. Now we need to go on to the last step where we log in as each of the users and make sure we've met all the objectives and just make sure everything checks off. So let's do that in the next video. Alright guys, time to see all our configuration work in action now. Alright, so let's take a look at the objectives again. So we can start off with the consultant user. This user should only have access to the new permission example project that we created and no other project in the instance. And the consultant should also have the ability to work on issues in that project. So let's go in as Jack Parker and let's log in through the admin. Okay, so right off the bat, our first test is failing, and so we can see the permission example project, but we can also see all the other projects we created, including the next gen project. So let's take a look at that. Can you guess why this might be happening? You can take a moment, pause the video, and see if you suspect where this is coming from. Okay, so I'm going to head back to Jira, and the answer lies in the permission scheme. So if you guessed that, then good on you, you're getting a good hang of this. So I'll come down to the permission schemes. And so these three projects are still using that default software scheme, whereas it's only the new project we created that's using the new one. So now if I take a look at these permissions, and if I just open that up in its own tab, the browse project permissions being given to any logged in user, which is why the consultant can see this. So what I'm going to do is, just for this example purpose, I'm going to remove the any logged in user. And so browse projects, what I'm going to do is normally you would come in and then you would assign this permission to a project role, such as the project team. But for now, because these projects do not have anyone assigned to the project team, and I don't want to spend time doing that right now, I'm just going to use a group, and I'm going to select the Jira Software Users group because the consultant and the customer users are not in this group. So they won't be able to browse any of these projects, which is exactly what we want. And I also want to modify the create issues permission. If you recall in the last example we did, we had the issue creator project role, but since we deleted that project role, no one really has permissions to create issues. So what I'm going to do is I will just assign it to the same group, and that's it. And one more thing we need to do is let's go to the next gen project and make sure that this is private. So we'll click on access, and right now it's open, so we can change this to be private. And that should be it. So let me close this tab. We're back in the admin section. So now let's go back as Jack Parker. Perfect. So now he only has access to the permission example project, which is what we want. So now let's go into the project and let's make sure that Jack can work on issues. So let's head over to the sprint view, and we can see that Jack has the ability to drag and drop the issue, which means he can work on the issues, he can transition them. You can see the columns are highlighting, which means that Jack has the permission. If I close this little thing here, you can see the complete sprint option is disabled. So Jack cannot manage sprints. You can see the little tooltip there. Maybe let's go into one of the issue details. You can see that he can edit the description. He can come in and he can put in a test comment. So overall, looks like Jack can modify things and work on these issues, transition them, so on and so forth. So far, it looks like we're good. And we're meeting the requirements for the consultant user. So let's switch back. I just need to get that little pop-up there. So I'm going to refresh the page. There it is. It's just an easy way to switch back to the administrator account. Okay, so now since we looked at the consultant user, the next user I want to actually look at is the developer, because the developer can also work on issues. So it's essentially the same as the consultant. So since we took a look at the consultant, let's just make sure the developer can do the same thing. But keep in mind that the developer is part of the team, like the overall company team, so they should be able to see all the other projects as well, except for the next-gen project, which is set to private. So now I'm logged in as the developer. Let's go to the projects page. Perfect. So we can see the new project, we can see the other ones. So now let's go into the permissions example project and just make sure that the developer can also work on issues. So here in the backlog, you can see the create sprint button disabled. So again, the developer doesn't have the manage sprint permission, which is what we expected. And if I click on any one of these issues, if I click on the description, I can modify it, hit save. I can put in a comment. If I go into the sprint view, I can drag and move issues around. So that's perfect. So that checks out as well. Great. Let's move on to the next user, which is going to be, let's look at our project owner. So the project owner should be able to administer the project and is the only one who can manage sprints. So this will be interesting. Let's take a look. So let's log in as Adam Smith. Okay, so he's part of the company, so he can view all the projects. Now, it's interesting that Adam Smith can see the My Next Gen project. So let's see what happens. Can he actually access it? If I open that up in its own tab, you can see it says project isn't available. So Adam Smith actually cannot access it, but the reason it's appearing here is because he can actually go into the project settings. Now, why can he go into the project settings? That's because, if you recall, Adam Smith is a trusted user, which makes him a Jira administrator, which means that he can go into the administration part of the projects as well, which is why he can actually come in just to the settings, but he cannot actually go back to the project and he cannot see any of the issues within the project. So in case you were confused by that, that was the reason, is that Adam Smith is a trusted user. Okay, so now let's go into our permissions example project. And here, if we head into the backlog view, or okay, we're in the sprint view. Let me close this. You can see the complete sprint button is enabled, so that's good. Can he move issues? Yes, he can, so he can work on it. That's perfect. If I come to the backlog, he can create a new sprint. So there we go. And he also has the project settings, or access to the project settings. Now, him being a trusted user is a moot point because, he has access to all the project settings. So in order to test this, we would need to make him a non-trust, like a basic user, and then we can do the test. So maybe let's just try that out quickly. So let's switch back and let's go to Adam's page and let's make him a basic user. Just make sure that updates. Okay, now let's log in as Adam again. All right, so there you go. The next gen project is now missing as expected. And if we come into the permissions example project, we still can see the project settings. So great. Looks like things look good for the project owner as well. The last one we have is the customer. So let's now take a look through Monica's eyes. Okay, so we will log in as Monica. Perfect. So the first thing is that she can only see the permissions example project and nothing else. So let's go in here. Now, the expectation, she should have access to the project alone, and she should have read-only access. So that means she should not be able to drag any of these issues. So you can see that none of the columns are highlighting, and if I try to do it, it'll tell me that something went wrong. Let me click on one of the issues. You can see as I click on the description, nothing's happening. I don't see a comment button. If I click on the in progress thing, it says I don't have permission to transition the issue. So overall, it looks like Monica Hall has read-only access and cannot really do anything or modify any of these fields, cannot update anything on the board. It's pure read-only access. So let's switch back. And that concludes our elaborate roles and permissions example. Hopefully it has shown you the different ways that you can configure users, but more importantly, demonstrated how you can take advantage of project roles and permission schemes. So that now brings us to the end of the users, groups, project roles, and permissions part of this entire admin section. Now we're going to move on to some other administrative functions in Jira that we can configure. We've spent the last few lectures on permissions and seen that projects have all the project roles that have been configured in Jira, and it's up to you to determine which users go into the project roles for each of the projects. Now, going beyond roles and permissions, projects also have many other items that you can configure, such as issue types, fields, screens, and workflows. So let's start taking a look at them one by one. And once again, I think it would be best to use real-world use cases as we go through them. So basically, you can configure each of these things and assign them to projects based on schemes, just like the permission schemes that we've talked about before, and saw that permission scheme is what associates a list of permissions to a project. So similarly, we've got issue types, and then issue type schemes which link the issue types to a project, just as an example. Or in other words, the issue type scheme tells us what issue types are available for us within a project. So let's look at how Jira connects all these things together. Jira has some default issue types like story, epic, tasks, etc. So you can go ahead and create your own issue type, and then issue types get grouped together and form an issue type scheme, which then gets mapped to a project. Similarly, you can create a custom field, and Jira gives you many options of different field types, so that you could create things like text fields, drop-downs, date pickers, even a user picker, and so on. And you can create your own field of any of these types. Once the field is created, you would need to obviously state which screen that field will show up on. You can also set the behavior of the field, things like, is the field mandatory or not, or perhaps it's a hidden field, and this is done in a field configuration. This field configuration is mapped to an issue type through a field configuration scheme, which, being a scheme, means that it gets mapped or assigned to a project. So for example, you could create a field called urgency, and you assign it to a particular screen. Then you can specify that the field is mandatory in its field configuration, and then finally say that this field configuration only applies to certain issue types, and then associate that to a project. And then we have screens that you see when working on issues, and you can basically create your own screen. Now there are 3 different ways you can see a screen, whether it's creating an issue, editing an issue, or viewing an issue. So these are what they call operation types. And so you can create a screen and then can specify which operation it should appear for. And this is done using a screen scheme. This screen scheme then gets mapped to an issue type via the issue type screen scheme, which finally gets assigned to a project. I know it might seem a little confusing now, but it'll all make sense once we go through the example. And so just to give you an example in theory, so for say I want to create screen A that will appear when I create an issue of the issue type story for project A. You can do all this through these screen configurations. Screens can also be mapped to workflow transitions. So for example, when I transition from an in-progress state to a done state for a particular issue, I can prompt for a screen to appear in case I want the user to fill something out whenever that transition occurs, such as filling out a field called implementation details of what the developer did when making or marking the ticket as done. Which then brings me to workflows.
We've already seen this in previous examples, and it basically defines the series of statuses that an issue can have and transitions that it can go through between these statuses. You can create different workflows and map it to issue types, so different issue types can have different workflows. And this mapping is done in a workflow scheme, which, as usual, will get assigned to a project. So we'll be going through these one by one by building the following example. So we'll first start by creating a new issue type called spike. Now, what is a spike? You may have heard of it. It actually exists in some types of Agile methodologies like extreme programming, and basically represents a ticket that involves research or investigation or design, basically something where you would need to gather information. An example would be having a feature request that can't be estimated because you would need to do some research on technology or feasibility of the request before you can actually work on it. So this issue doesn't exist, or this issue type doesn't exist in Jira by default, so we'll be creating one as an example. We're then going to add that spike issue type to one of the projects that we've created in this course, and then we'll create a screen for that issue type, map the various operations through the screen scheme, and then map that screen scheme to the issue type through the issue type screen scheme. Then we're going to create some custom fields for the new screen. So in particular, things like a spike type. So we can create this as a drop-down field, and it'll have options of investigation or research. What kind of spike ticket are you creating? We'll have a field called spike results, which is a text field. The user can just put in the information that they collected as a result of the spike. And then we can put in a high-level work effort estimation. Now, obviously, the world is yours in terms of what fields you want to configure for the issue types that you create or the screens that you create, but we'll just use these as an example. And then we'll also walk through the field configurations and their schemes. And then finally, the workflows. Now this is a major feature and aspect of Jira that makes it so customizable and dynamic to work with. So first we'll modify an existing workflow that exists for an issue type that's already being used within the project. We'll make sure that we go through the Agile board to map these workflow changes to that board. Then we'll create a new workflow for this new spike issue type that we just created, and we'll talk about some workflow transitions and general other tips and tricks or things that would be worth knowing about workflows. And that would bring us to the end of the example. So just to show you where all these things get configured, coming back to my Jira instance, all of these can be seen in the Issues tab of the administration page. So you've got issue types, workflows, screens, fields, and that's pretty much covering everything, all the core pieces of Jira while working on issues. So we're going to start off with issue types in the video, and then we'll go through them one by one.
Alright, let's start off with our elaborate schemes example, where we will first create our spike issue type. We will then, after that, create the screens that we would want to display for the various issue operations for the spike issue type. We will then create some custom fields to go on those screens, and then we'll finally look at workflows. So starting with the issue types, once again, just as a reminder, I am in the issues section of the Jira settings. So there you can find everything that we need for the next couple of videos. So looking at the issue types, these are the default issue types that come with Jira. And you can see that the issue types also have a type in the sense that it could either be a standard issue type or a subtask. So standard issue type is, well, it's your standard issue type that you can select whenever you create an issue. Now, any issue type that is of type subtask basically means that you can create that issue under, or it belongs to, or belongs under a standard issue type. So usually, subtask is the default one available. You would create subtasks under a task or a story. So you can create other issue types that are of the same subtask type that you can create under one of the standard issue types. Okay, And then here you've got your related schemes, basically saying that this issue type exists in the following schemes. Now, just as a refresher, I know we've been through a lot of theory, and we're going to be going through the actual example here. But just to refresh your memory, a scheme, in this case an issue type scheme, is basically a group of issue types. And then that scheme is assigned to a project. So that implies that the issue types in that group are available for that project. So we will take a look at these schemes in just a bit. And then coming here to the right side, you can actually edit the name and description of the default bug issue type. But be very careful when renaming an issue type, because any project that uses it will then see the new name. So doing something like that could end up confusing your users. So definitely be wary of that. So what we're going to be doing is we will be creating a spike issue type. So I'll come up here to the top, click add issue type, and we'll call this spike. You can put in a description if you want, and we want it to be a standard issue type. So let's click add. So now we have spike, and I'm not a big fan of the icon here, so I'm going to edit it again. And let's select a different avatar. You can upload your own, but I'll just go with the question mark. Well, because it's a question mark, you don't know if you can work on the feature until you complete the spike investigation or whatever is required for it. So let's click on update. And that's it. So now we have our issue type, which is available across Jira. So let's head over to our issue type schemes. So these are a list of all the issue type schemes. And you may notice that there is a different scheme that has been created for each project that we have been working with. So that's what Jira does. Every time you create a new project, it tends to create a new scheme for it, whether it's an issue type scheme or a screen scheme, workflow scheme. We will look at that later. But you can see that because the nature or the type of projects that we're creating have been the same, the schemes are all the same. You can see the same issue types in each of these schemes. So it almost seems redundant, right? Ideally, if projects are using the same issue types, all of them should be using the same issue type scheme. That's where creating projects with similar configurations come in, and we will look at that later. For now, it looks like we've got different schemes, and so these are the group of issue types in each of the schemes, and then over here you can see the project that is using that scheme. And you can even create your own custom issue type scheme. So let's say you decide that all the projects going forward are going to use one standard issue type scheme. You can come in here, you can click on add, and then you can give it a name, and then you can just drag and drop whatever issue types you feel you're going to use. And then you can even specify what the default issue type is going to be. And then you can save that and then assign that issue type scheme to all your projects going forward. But what I will do is I will cancel this. Because I already have so many created, I will just use the one that was created for the permissions example project. And in fact, I can go in, edit the existing one, and maybe I can rename this to just say main. So representing that this is my main issue type scheme for all my software projects. And I'm going to come in here and we can see spike available, and we can drag that into the issue types for this scheme. And I'll leave the default issue type as is, basically implying that any new issue that I create in this project or in a project that's using the scheme, the default one will be story. All right, so let's hit save. And so now we've got the main Scrum issue type scheme, and we can see it's only being used by permissions example project right now. So the spike will not be available for the other projects. And you can even see this in the project settings. So if I open that up in its own tab, you can see we're in the project settings. And if we come down here to issue types, so here it'll tell you that this project is using the main Scrum issue type scheme, and these are all the issue types available, including spike. So the last thing to do here is to actually test it out. So let's go ahead and create an issue. And we want to make sure that the permissions example project is selected. Now, I do not see that as an option. And you know what? It probably has something to do with permissions because I'm logged in as the administrator. So quickly, let's digress. Let's go into the people section of the project here. And you can see that the administrator is actually not part of any of these. So what I'm going to do is I will add that account into the project team. Click add. Okay, so let's try that out again. Perfect. So now I can see the permissions example project, and the default is story, but if I select that, I see the spike option. So there you go. The issue type is working and available. And just to confirm, if I now select another project, we should see that the spike is not available. So that confirms that spike is only available in the project that we're dealing with. Okay, so I will cancel this for now. And let's go back to the issue types page. So that's it. We have created our new issue type. Now, in general, you might wonder, when should you create and use a new issue type? Well, an issue type, I guess, just represents some kind of work, like unique kind of work. The first clue would be, is it an area of work that cannot be represented by your pre-existing issue types that you have? If it cannot be represented, then yeah, go ahead and create one to represent that kind of work. Another good indication is if that kind of work needs to have its own workflow, then it does make sense to have a different issue type, because you can configure different workflows for each issue type in a project. As you can see here in the workflow column, all of the issue types are using the same workflow, but you have the ability to specify a different one for each issue type. So yeah, if that's something you need, then creating an issue type for that work would definitely make sense. Alright, so the next thing we'll be doing is working on the screens for this new Spike issue type. So let's go into the next video and take a look at that. Okay, so we've created our Spike issue type. Now we're going to be looking at screens. And just to give you another quick theory refresher, we will be creating our screens, and then we will be mapping our screens to issue operations like the create, edit, view operations through a screen scheme. And then we will take a screen scheme and we will map it to an issue type through the issue type screen scheme, and then we will assign that to the project. Okay, so hopefully it will be clear by the end of the video. So let's head over to our screens section. Okay, so these are the screens that we have so far in this Jira instance. Once again, Jira creates a bunch of screens by default for each project, and you can see in terms of naming convention, it puts the project key in front of the screen name. And something to note is for Jira software projects, Jira ends up creating two screens by default. One is a bug screen and another is a default issue screen for all the other issue types. Now, here in the next two columns, this basically represents where this screen is being used. So it can either be used in a screen scheme, which tells you that, it's associated with an issue operation, or it could also be used in a workflow as part of a transition. So for example, when you're transitioning from in progress to done, you can have it so that a screen gets displayed during that transition. So this tells you that the screens are either displayed or being used in a scheme or in a workflow. And then when you come here, you can click on configure for a screen, and it will list out all the fields that are being displayed on that screen. So let's go back. Okay, so now let's take a look at the screen scheme. So I'll use the screen scheme as an example. You'll probably notice when you start using all these terms a lot, they start to become tongue twisters. So anyway, looking at the bug screen scheme, this, once again, it maps an issue operation to a screen. So right now, it's saying that this is used for all unmapped operations. Right now, a specific operation is not mapped to a screen, so hence it basically means all the operations will end up displaying this particular screen. Now you can go in and you can map a specific operation by coming up here to the top, and you can see the operations that are available. So you can say, all right, for the create issue operation, I want to display a specific screen. So that is how you can configure the screen schemes. Now coming here to the issue type screen schemes, this is where you can map a screen scheme to an issue type. So looking at the one that's created for the permissions example project, this basically says that, okay, for all the bug issue types, we want to use the bug screen scheme, and for everything else, we will use the default screen scheme. Make sense? You know, another way where you can actually try to make more sense of all of this is to work your way backwards, starting from the highest level. So let me go to the issue type screen schemes page. This lists all the issue type screen schemes, and you can see which ones are used by the respective project. So let's look at the permissions example project, for example, and work our way backwards. So this project uses this issue type screen scheme. Okay, when I come in here, this tells me that the bug uses the bug screen scheme, whereas this uses the default screen scheme. So let's use the bug as an example and go to the bug screen scheme. Okay, so now we're in the screen scheme section, and this tells me that for bugs, it maps all the different operations to this one screen. That means doesn't matter what I do, whether I'm creating or editing or viewing a bug, I will see this Scrum bug screen. And when I click on that, I can then see all the fields that I will see on the screen. So hopefully looking at it that way made it a little more clear. So let's head back to our screens and actually create our screens. We're going to say that with respect to the spike issue type, we will have one screen that you see when creating a spike issue and another different screen when viewing or editing a spike issue. So basically two screens that we will be creating. So let's come up here to the top, and in fact, you know what? You can add a completely new screen and start from scratch, or in fact, I'll prefer to just copy one of the existing ones. So let me use the PEP default issue screen, and let me copy that. And then let me just name it accordingly. Now I can choose to call it main, just like we did with the issue type, but you know, I'll have to rename all the other screen schemes and everything, so I'll just continue using PEP for now. And this I will call the Scrum Spike issue screen. Okay, and hit copy. Okay, so now we can see the new screen created, and it's not really being used anywhere. We haven't set it to be used anywhere, so it's not affiliated with anything. But let me go ahead and create the second screen. So I'll copy this one. And so this screen, I will call the Scrum Spike Create Issue screen, because we would want to display that every time we create a new spike issue. Okay, so now we have our two screens. Let's go ahead, and I'm actually going to modify the Create Issue screen because I want it to be super simple. I don't need to display all these fields, so let me get rid of a lot of them. So I'll keep the summary because that's important. I'll maybe move the issue type above that. Let's get rid of some of these other ones that we don't need. Keep the description, don't really need linked issues and all this stuff, and maybe come here to the bottom. Okay, so let's just go with these 5 fields for the Create Issue screen for spikes. Let's go back. Actually, that's it. We're done in terms of creating our screens. Now let's look at the screen schemes. So coming into here, these are a list of all the screen schemes, and we can see that the PEP project, I guess there are 2 screen schemes tied to PEP. One is for the default screen scheme, and another one is a bug screen scheme. So we need to create one for the spike. So let's click Add Screen Scheme, and in fact, I will just copy this name so that it's easier, and you keep the naming convention consistent. So we will call this the Scrum Spike Screen Scheme, and the default screen I will actually select the PEP Scrum Spike Issue screen that we created. Okay, so now we are in the screen scheme, and we need to map the issue operation to a screen. So I'll come up here, and I will say that the Create Issue operation, I want the Create Issue screen. And for everything else, we will use the regular spike issue screen. Okay, and that's it. So we have our screen scheme configured. The next step would be the issue type screen scheme. So this is the one used by the permissions example project. Let's go into that. And so here, I'm sure you would guess that we come up here and associate an issue type, and we want to pick our spike issue type, and then now we select the new spike screen scheme that we just created. And that's it. So coming back here, we know that the permissions example project uses this issue type screen scheme. In fact, I still have the project settings open in another tab. We can actually see this all summarized when you go to the screen section of the project settings. So here you can see that this project uses the PEP Scrum issue type screen scheme. And within that, you've got all these different screen schemes. And you can see which issue type uses which screen scheme. So we can see here the new one that we just created is being used by Spike. And if I expand that, you can see for the Spike issue, all these various issue operations are mapped to the respective screen. So I kind of always like the way that this page lays everything out. So our next and final step would be to test it out. So let's create an issue. We're in the correct project. Let's select Spike. And here you can see that we're only seeing those 5 fields that we set. So that looks like it's working. If I were to switch to story, we're now seeing all the other fields that we had initially removed. So let me go back to Spike and let's just create a test ticket. I'll hit create. Let's go to it. You can open it up in its own tab. Okay. Now we are looking at the new issue view. So this is the view screen, and you can see we're able to see all the other fields as well. Now technically I can edit this issue from the view screen itself. So, the distinction between the edit and the view screens applied more so to the older view of this issue details page. But with this new issue view, I'm not sure if Jira is planning on keeping them. Maybe in the future they're going to get rid of the edit issue operation and we will only have the create and the view. But who knows, that is still to be determined. But for now, it does look like as we're viewing this issue, we can see all the other fields. So I think we can mark our test as successful. Now let's move on to creating our custom fields and adding them onto the screens. Alright, we've created our issue types and corresponding screens for it. The next thing we'll be doing is creating some custom fields. So I'm still in the issues part of the Jira settings, and everything to do with fields can be found here under fields. So I'll click on custom fields, and here you can find all the fields that are currently configured in Jira. And it is really easy to create a custom field. You just come up here to the top right and click create custom field. And you can see that there are a set number of field types that are available. So they're pretty self-explanatory. So things like checkboxes, date pickers, number field, if you need drop-down lists or single or multi-line text fields, so on and so forth. They also have some advanced field types available. Now, I don't use these very often, but maybe the one that I would use the most is probably the message custom field. For either an edit screen or a view screen. What that basically allows us to do is to display some kind of text on a screen. So for example, if you're displaying a screen in the middle of a workflow transition and you want to display some instructions at the top of the screen, you can use this message custom field to display that text. But what we will be doing is we will be creating some standard field types for the spike issue that we created. So let us, the first one that I'm going to select and create is the spike type field. And that is going to be a drop down. So I'll come in and select the select list, single choice, hit next, and let's give it a name. We'll call it spike type. You can put in a description, and then you can put in your options for the drop down. So I will be putting in research, investigation, or other. Okay, and then hit create. And in the next step, Jira is going to ask you, what screens would you like to put this field on? Now, you don't have to select a screen. You can just come down here and either click update or cancel. The field will still get created. It just wouldn't be on any screen yet. But since we've already created our screens, I'm going to come in and find the Spike Create Issue screen. We definitely want that field on this screen, as well as the general Spike Issue screen that we created. So I'll select these two and hit update. And so now if I go to the second page here, we can see our new Spike type field, what kind of field it is, and so on and so forth. You can customize it from there. You can see it's got two screens. One more thing I want to show about this, in particular the select list, is that it's got contexts, and you can define contexts for certain screens. So if I come in here, click on the ellipsis, and click on contexts and default values. So this is going to take me into the details of the field, and here you can specify, so obviously you can edit your options once again. You can specify a default value. So if you want one of these values to be selected by default, you can do that here. You can also apply this field to certain contexts. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I click on Edit Configuration, you can specify that this field is only going to be available for certain issue types, or even down here you can specify for certain projects. So you can see here, right now it's a global context, so it applies to all the issues in Jira, or you can limit it so that the field only really applies to issues under a certain set of projects. I'm going to leave this as default for now, but I just wanted to show you that this option is available for fields. Okay, let me go back to the custom field list. Alright, so the next custom field we want to create is going to be a multi-line text field, and it's going to be the results, so essentially the Spike results. So I'll select text field multi-line, hit next. We will call this Spike results. I'll skip the description for now. Hit create. Once again, it's going to give me the list of screens. Now, the Spike results, given that that's something you really only need to enter once your work is done for the Spike ticket, I don't need to put that into the create issue screen for the Spike. I'll just do it on the general Spike issue screen. So I'll select that, hit update. Okay, and the last custom field that I want to create is going to be another select list, and this is going to be the work effort. So I'll come in, select this, hit next, and I just want to include what the work effort will be. So is it going to be a small amount of work, medium, or large? Okay, and you can even click and drag the order if you want, but I'll leave it as is. Hit create. And again, this is something you know only once the work is done, so I will add it only in the general screen and click update. Okay, and that's it. So let's do a quick demo. If I click on the create button, so we have the Spike issue type. And now if I scroll down, we can see the new field that we just created, Spike type, with the drop down and the options that we had configured for it. So I can go ahead and let me just create this ticket again as the second ticket, hit create. Okay, let's go into that. I'll open that up in its own tab just so we can see the other fields. So the Spike types here, the work effort is right below that. And if I select that, I get the options. And the Spike results, because it is a multi-line field, those only show up in the description part of the issue, this area, so we can see our Spike results field right there. Okay, now let's say for any Spike ticket, you want the description field and the Spike type field to be mandatory. So you can set them accordingly, you can specify them to be mandatory, but you have to be careful and make sure that you only do that for Spike issues. You don't want that for everything else, because remember, the description field shows up for all issue types. So if you set it to be mandatory in general, then it's going to end up being mandatory for all issue types, which is not what we want. So to specify custom field behavior, we do that in the field configurations. So let's go into there. Right now you can see Jira only has one default field configuration, which is basically being used by all the projects. So if I go into it, you can see a list of all the fields, And here, it specifies all the different behaviors. So you can hide fields, you can specify them to be required. It lists out all the screens that the fields are on, and even some of the fields, like any multi-line text fields, you can specify what the renderer should be. So for example, a description is using a wiki style renderer, so it's easy to edit the text in there. You can switch that to be just a plain text field renderer as well. So this is where you can specify the behavior. Now if I were to come in and set this to being required, so now if I scroll down, I can see description has a required lozenge on it. Now if I try to create an issue, you can see that the description has a red asterisk, which implies that it's mandatory, and I do have the spike type selected, but if I switch to story, it's also mandatory, and even the same thing for bugs. So this is not what we want. So I'm going to cancel that, come back to the description, and now change it back to optional. And let's go back to our field configuration page, and we will need to create a new one for spike issues. So I'll copy this one, and let's call this the spike field configuration, and update the description accordingly. Hit copy. Alright, so now we've got our new field configuration. So now I can go in and configure that, and you can see it lists out the exact same number of fields, but because this is a different field configuration, I can come in here and I can now say the description is required, and then come down and confirm it, and then scroll down further, look for the spike type field, and make that required as well. Okay, now that is it. So we've configured the behavior in this field configuration. The next step is to map it to an issue type, in particular the spike issue type. So that is done in the field configuration schemes. So when I go there, right now you can see that it says there are no current field configuration schemes that have been configured. However, that is not entirely true. There is a default system configuration scheme, and that is set up behind the scenes. I guess it's not showing it because Jira does not want you to modify it, but I can show by going into the project settings again. I still have the tab open. So I'm in the project settings. If I come down to fields, here you can see that it's using the system default field configuration. And so this is kind of what's hidden on the field configuration scheme, but it does exist. And you can see under this scheme, it has the default field configuration, which we saw, where all the issue types are just using this field configuration, and the behavior is described accordingly. So in the required column here, you can see that description is not required, but other fields like the issue type and the reporter and the summary are required. And that is expected. That is the case for all issues whenever you create one. Okay, so coming back here to the field config schemes, we need to create a new one for the spike issue type. So I'll go ahead and I'll click Add Field Configuration. Let's give it a name, and let's click Add. Okay, so what that did is it actually took me right into the field configuration scheme page. So just to show you again, if I go back here, now you can see in the list of all the field config schemes that we have, we've got the new one that we created, and I can either click on configure or just click on the name, and now we're taken into the actual scheme, and we can see by default it's using all or mapping all the issue types to the default field configuration. So what we now want to do is we want to associate the spike issue with the new field configuration that we just created down here in the field configuration section. So we'll click Add. Okay, so we have now set up the scheme. Now we need to go back to the project and make sure it uses the new scheme. So I can come up here to the top right, click Actions, and then use a different scheme. And instead of the system default, I will select the new spike field config scheme that we created, hit Associate. And so now you can see all these issue types here are using the default field config, whereas the spike is using the spike field config. And if I expand that and look at the required column and scroll down, you can see the description is set to yes as being required. And if I scroll down further, so is the spike type. Okay, so now let's do another test. So I'll hit create. And the first thing I want to do, okay, so we have bug selected. We can see description is not mandatory. That's good. Let me switch to spike. All right, perfect. So description looks like it's mandatory. So I'll call this test spike 3. If I try to hit create, it's going to tell me that description is required right there. So I can put in a description. And if I try to do it again, it's now going to complain that the spike type is required. So I need to come in and specify that. And only then will it allow me to create the issue. So there you go. That's how you can create custom fields and control their behavior through these field configurations. Now, one important thing to note, and it's a very important thing actually, if you set a field to be mandatory, make sure it appears on the create issue screen. So in our example, we had the spike type field is mandatory and the description of course, and both of them appeared on the create issue screen. If you set a field as mandatory and don't display it on that create issue screen, then Jira won't let you create the issue and you'll be stuck because it's going to complain about the field not being set, but you can't even set it because it's not on the screen. So definitely keep that in mind and be careful when creating new field config schemes and setting fields to be mandatory. We are now going to get into workflows over the next few videos actually, because workflows are essentially one of Jira's core features that make it so dynamic and customizable. In fact, I might say that the main difference you see between the various project templates that come with Jira is that they have different pre-configured workflows to match the project type activities. Alright, so we are in the workflows section of the issues part of the Jira settings. And we can see all the workflows that have been created by default for each respective project. And you can see here that the naming convention has a software simplified workflow in it. And so this is basically what Jira calls all the workflows it creates for software projects. Now, the main characteristic about these workflows is that it has these predefined statuses, and you can transition from any status to any other status, as we have seen before. Now, you can also create your custom workflows from scratch. But let's take a look at the workflows, and we have touched on them briefly before. So we've got the sample Scrum project and the sample Kanban project. Let me open them up in their own respective tabs. So this is the workflow for the Scrum project, and this is what would end up being used for any Scrum project that you create. Now, throughout these videos, you're probably going to see this pop up. I am currently zoomed in a couple of levels in my browser, and for some reason the workflow designer keeps giving this pop up, so you're going to keep seeing it, and it's really annoying. I can close it out, but it'll keep coming back, so I apologize for that distraction, but just bear with me here. So this is the workflow, and we've seen this. You can transition. You've got 3 statuses, main statuses, and you can transition from one to any of the other ones. And that is for Scrum, and this is the Kanban version. Basically just has one extra status for selected for development. And the reason, I guess main reason, is because you can take the backlog and move it into the backlog of the Kanban board so that the first column ends up being the one selected for dev. Now, these workflows, you can view it in this diagram format, or you can also view it in a text format, which lays it out accordingly. But I always personally prefer to see the diagram format because it's much easier to modify and to even just look at. Okay, so let me close these tabs out. And here in the list of workflows, you can see the assigned workflow schemes for each of the workflows. So once again, the workflow scheme maps the workflow to an issue type. So let's take a look at all the workflow schemes. Once again, we have some default ones that were created and assigned to each respective project. And so, for example, the permissions example project uses the PEP software simplified workflow scheme. And for that scheme, you can see all the unassigned types, meaning all the issue types in the project, are using this workflow. So it looks like each of these projects have all their respective issue types mapped to their respective workflow. So what is our goal here? It is to create a new workflow for the permissions example project, but only for the spike issue type. So let's go back to the workflows page. Now what I can do here is I can just copy the existing PEP workflow that has been created and then just work off of that. Or I can come up here and just start a brand new workflow from scratch. So let me do it that way. So I'll come in here and let's call this Spike workflow. We'll hit add. Okay, so this is me creating a workflow from scratch. And once again, apologies for that pop-up dialog. So we only really have one status, which is the status that any issue you create as part of this workflow will go into. So right now it's open, and I can just bring this transition. Once I select it, I can just bring that up to the top just to make it look a little better. Okay, so let's think of what the spike ticket workflow can be. And this is obviously something that you would need to plan out and discuss with your stakeholders before diving into creating any workflow or designing any workflow for your teams. So when we create a spike ticket, it should probably go into a to-do status. Now you can just continue using the open status if you want. Really implies the same thing. It's really up to your team. So once the status, or once I guess the ticket is pending, it's in the to-do state. And then based on the, whether it's research or investigation, once someone starts working on it, it can go into an in progress state. And then once the work has been completed, it can be marked as done. So essentially just three statuses: to do, in progress, done. So once again, it is a very basic workflow. I do not want to overcomplicate the first workflow that we create here, but don't worry. I will try to have some examples of some more complicated workflows later in the course, probably in the bonus and example section of the course. Okay, so let's start building this out. First thing is, if I don't want the open status, I can come in and I can remove it, but let's see what Jira tells me. If I try that, it says you can't delete the initial status. So let's go ahead and let's add our to-do status. So by coming up here and clicking add status, I can see all the existing statuses that are available in Jira right now to choose from. And it looks like there is a to-do status already there. If there's a status that you need that isn't already created, you can just come in and type out whatever you want, and you can see that it'll opt in to create it as a new status. So for now, let's just use the existing one, the to-do status, and you can allow all statuses to transition to this one. So if I select it and click add, it adds it in there, and you can see the same all arrow going into it. But this is not what we want, because that's essentially the same as the simplified workflow that comes by default. So I will remove this by selecting the transition and then clicking delete transition. Okay, now we have the to-do status. We can take the creation arrow and just move it to the new status. And now I can come in and I can delete or remove the open status. Okay, perfect. So the next status we want to add is in progress. So once again, we can find that here. Click add. And then the last one would be the done status. Click add. All right, perfect. And then we can position them accordingly using the workflow designer. All right. The next step would be to go in and put in our transitions. So you can add a transition by coming up here and just clicking add transition, or you can just do it in the workflow designer by linking, so starting off from to do and then link it to the in progress status, and you'll get this pop up to add the transition. So you can confirm the respective statuses and then put in a name. Now you could call this start spike, but I would not recommend this. It is always best practice to keep your transition names and even status names as generic as possible, so you can reuse the same workflows for multiple projects and multiple issue types. If I were to call this start spike, and if I decide to reuse this workflow for something completely different, and then the users go in and they see this as being one of the transitions, it'll be confusing because, what is a spike, right? So it's always better to keep it generic. So I'll just call it start work. And here you can opt in to display a screen during that transition, but I'll just leave it as none for now. Click add, and there's our transition. And then we will do another one from in progress to done, and let's just call this done. Click add, and that's pretty much it. There is our workflow for the spike issue type. And since we were talking about transitions, I also want to just point out that by coming up here, you can actually transition from a status to itself. And so, if I were to just do this by example and click add, there you have a transition going into itself. And really the purpose of it is if you want certain functionality to happen while an issue is in a status, you can do that transition, and then it basically just stays in the same place in terms of the workflow, but some functionality can be invoked. So let me just delete this for now. I just wanted to show you that as a possibility. Okay, so we've completed the workflow. It's very basic, and you can see that the status of the workflow is currently inactive. So if I go back to the workflows page, these are all the active workflows. And then if I expand the inactive section, I can see our workflow here. It's not currently assigned to any workflow scheme. So let's head over to our workflow schemes. And we want to modify the one that's used by the permissions example project. So we'll click on edit. So this tells me that all the unassigned issue types are using this. So we can come in and we can add an existing workflow. Look for the one that we just created. You can confirm that that's the correct one. Click next. And here you can specify what issue type to associate it to. So I'll select spike, click finish. So now we can see spike uses the spike workflow, whereas everything else uses the normal default workflow. Now always remember to publish this. You'll notice that at the top. So it's not currently saved. So let me hit publish. And then associate, and then Jira does its thing, and then click acknowledge. And now if we go back to the workflows page, you can see the spike workflow now showing up under active, and it is part of the same the workflow scheme that is used by the PEP project. So now we can actually go ahead and do a demo. So I'll head over back to the project page. And since we're here, let's just take a look at the workflow section of the project settings. And you can see that it is using the scheme, and it lays it out in the same way that the spike issue type is using the spike workflow. Alright, so let's head back to the project. And maybe I'll go to the issues and filters section. And alright, so we're looking at the open issues, and we have a couple of spikes and then all the other issue types as well. So looking at the spike, this is currently in the to-do status. So when I click on the workflow dropdown, you can see the only transition I can do is to start work that'll move it into the in progress status. Because if you recall, the workflow, which you can see here, is just a sequential transition from one status to the next. Can't really go back. But if I select the story here, we can transition from in progress to any one of them, because once again the workflow lets you go from anywhere to anywhere else. So there you go, we just created a new workflow and seen how different issue types within a project can follow different workflows. Now let's look at editing an existing workflow. Maybe we will just modify this one, the one that's used by all the other issue types in this project. Let's also take a look at how we can modify an existing workflow. And the one that we will be modifying is the one that is used by all the issue types except spike in the permission example project. So coming up here, I can just click on edit, and we're taken into the same familiar workflow view, which is essentially the workflow designer. But the first thing I want to point out is that at the top, you can see that we are currently editing a draft workflow. So what Jira does is every time you edit a live workflow, it basically creates a copy of it and puts that in draft mode, because it's not going to let you modify the live one since it's live and there are issues that are using that workflow. So it creates a copy, puts it in draft mode, and you can come in and you can make your changes, and once you're done, you can publish the draft, or you can discard them, if you don't want to keep your changes. So when you click publish draft, you'll get a pop-up here asking you if you want to take a backup of what is currently live. So if you select yes, then you can provide a name of your backup, and that essentially goes into the inactive workflow list, and this draft then becomes the live version. So I'll just cancel for now. I just wanted to show you what that process looks like. But I also want to mention that you can't make all kinds of changes to a live workflow. Jira only allows you to publish this draft if the changes you're doing are not overly intrusive. Because there are some types of changes that Jira won't allow you when the workflow is already live. So let me show you an example. If I were to come in here, this is the current workflow, so we're working on the draft version. Let me just move things around a little bit. So if I were to delete this all transition, so that's fine, no problem there. But now if I want to add my own transition from to do to in progress, and just like before, let's call this start work and click add, you can see that this is a change that Jira does not allow you to do to a live workflow. So what I mean by that is this is currently on a draft workflow, but your intent is to make it live. And so Jira cannot allow that. And if you click on this more information link, it'll just take you to a page that lists out some of these use cases or changes that are not allowed. So for example, another one that isn't allowed is you cannot rename the workflow. You cannot rename a live workflow, or you cannot delete a status, and I guess some of the transitions are also not allowed. So how would you go about doing this then? Well, you essentially need to make this workflow inactive, and then you can edit and do whatever you want and then make it active again. So let's go through that process. So for now, I will just discard this draft. So let's go back to the workflow page. So this is the workflow we want. What I will do is I will just make a copy of it. And I'm okay with the name of that. Let's click copy. So now we're in the copied workflow. Let me just go back to the workflows page to show you that it is currently inactive. So what we want to do is we want to update the permission scheme to use the copy while we make changes to the actual workflow. And then once we are done with the changes, we will switch it back and use the main one instead. So let's do that. I'll head over to the workflow scheme. And so this is the scheme we're concerned about. Let's click on edit. So here we want to replace this live one. This is the one we want to edit. So right now we will replace it with the copy. So I'll come in here, click add workflow, add existing, look for the copy. So there it is. And we'll click next. Now we want to replace the existing one, which is right here, and all the unassigned issue types are using that. So when I select that, it'll give you a warning that basically says that this current one will then be deleted from the scheme and replaced by the one that you're adding. So we'll click finish. Perfect. So now we can see the copy being used. So remember to publish it and then associate and then acknowledge. And that's it. So now we're using the copy. And if I go back to workflows, we can see that the copy is being used while our main one is down here in the inactive list, right here. So here we can now go in, click edit, and we can do everything we want to our heart's content. So starting off with the change that I tried to do, I'll delete this transition and let's move things around here just to clean it up a little bit. And now if I want to, let's bring this down, bring this up. If I want to add that transition, call it start work, click add, and it lets me do that because this is an inactive workflow. Okay, so now let's start modifying this workflow a little more and adding a couple more statuses. Now regarding statuses and editing a workflow, this is something that is very important to note. You can click on a status, you can click on edit, and you can actually rename the status to whatever you want. But be very careful of this because this status is used by all workflows, or it can be used by many workflows in your Jira instance. So by coming in here and modifying the name would actually modify it for all the other workflows as well that is using the status. So be really careful. I always recommend, or it's always safer to not modify an existing status unless you know for sure that this is the only workflow using it. It's always better that if you have a status that you need that doesn't already exist, just come in here and create it as a new status. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Alright, so let's continue modifying this. I'm going to remove all transitions, basically going away from that simplified workflow that comes with Jira by default. And now I'm going to build it out with some new statuses. Okay, so an issue gets created, goes to to-do, then the developer starts work on it, goes to in progress, and then once development is done, I want it to go to code review. So I'm going to add a status, and let's call it code review, because I know it doesn't exist already. So you can see it's going to be a new status. Click on it, click add, and I get the new status pop up. So I can put in or verify the name, put in a description, and here you've got your status categories. And right now we only have 3 status categories, and at least as of this recording, you're not able to go in and add your own. And this status category basically represents how Jira sees the issue in the overall life cycle. So whether it is in a to-do, so work hasn't started, or work has started and it's in progress, or the work's been completed and it's done. And each of these categories has a color associated with it, which colors in the respective status. So we'll take a look at that in just a bit. But something like code review means that work has already started for this particular, whatever item it is. So it would actually be in the in progress category. We'll hit create. And you can see that this status lozenge is now a blue color, representing in progress. So we'll bring that down here. Now, after code review, I want it to go into a testing queue, because your QA team may not be available to start testing on it right away. They may be working on other things. So I want to create a queue, basically a status, and I want to call it ready for testing. So again, it's going to be a new status. It's going to be an in progress category. Hit create, and let's bring that down here. Then once QA team picks it up, it will go into the in testing status. Click add, once again in progress, create, and then bring that, wrong status. Let's make sure we get the right one. All right, let's reposition this. Okay, so we've got our statuses. Now let's create our transitions. So from in progress, I can go to code review and I can call this dev complete, click add, and then from code review, I can move it to ready for testing, and I can just call it the same thing for the transition. And then once QA is ready to work on it, they can start testing to move it into the in testing status. And then finally, we will mark it as done once all the testing is complete. Now, in the real world, this is probably not realistic. Not all work is going to transition in a unidirectional way. There's a high probability that a lot of issues are probably going to need to go back as well. So I'm just doing a couple of examples, but you can obviously go in and you can add more flexibility and more transitions. But just for example purposes, let's say that QA is testing and they find some issues, so they need to send it back to the development team. So I'll move it back to in progress. And here you can actually reuse a transition that has already been made. So currently, start work is the only transition available, which doesn't really make sense here because you're not starting work, you're just sending it back to dev. So I'm just going to call this back to dev, click add, and then the same thing I guess for code review. If the review fails, you can send it back to the developer, and now in this case, I can reuse the same back to dev transition. Click add, and that's it. I think I'll leave it at that. Obviously, the power is yours in terms of how much customization you want to do, how many statuses to add and transitions to allow. It's really up to you and your team. Okay, so we have modified this workflow. Remember that it is still inactive. So now we need to go back to the workflow schemes and we need to swap it back. So let's click edit, and I will add existing. And let's look for the one we want. So it's this one for PEP. We can confirm that that's the right diagram. Click next. And once again, select all unassigned issue types. Click finish. So now it's replaced the copy. And we publish the scheme. Associate. Acknowledge. And now it's demo time. So I'll go over to my second tab. We're looking at all the issues in the permission example project, all the open issues. So I have my story selected. Let me just do a refresh just to be safe. So this issue is currently in progress, and when I look at the drop-down, I can see only one transition available, which is code review. And when I look at the workflow, so that's correct, verified that it is using the updated workflow. So from code review, then I expect that I should be able to either go back to dev or ready for testing. So let's first move it to code review by invoking the dev complete transition. So now it's in code review. And then from there you can see the other two options, either back to dev or ready for testing, so on and so forth. And then if I go to my spike, that is just going to continue with the initial workflow we created. And so that confirms that. Alright, so that's how you can edit a workflow, and you can customize it any which way you want. It's a really cool feature of Jira that allows you to customize how your team works on any given project. It basically governs how an issue can walk through from start all the way to completion. Now, we modified this workflow for a Scrum-based project. So we also need to make sure we update the Agile board accordingly so that the new statuses show up on the board. So let's take a look at that in the next video. Now that we've modified an existing workflow, let's update the Agile board to reflect the new statuses. So I'm in the permissions example project. Let me go back and let's take a look at the active sprints view. So it looks like we still have only 3 columns, but we have added a few more statuses. So let's head over to the board settings. I'll pop that open in its own tab. And we will take a look at the columns. And here you can see all our new statuses that are currently unmapped to a column. So we need to map them for the issues to appear on the board. So one thing you could do is you could just take all of them and map them to the in progress column, but then that would mean that all the issues that are in progress that are in any one of these statuses will just show up in one single column. I probably wouldn't prefer to do this. I would more often than not create a column for each status. So let me go ahead and do that. I'll create a code review column and another one for in testing. And then finally, ready for testing. And then of course the ready for testing should come before in testing. And I can move the statuses accordingly. So now if we go back to the board, there we go. We've got all our columns. And so we can see there's one issue in code review status, and there's nothing really ready or in testing. Another thing you could do is if I go back to the settings, the columns, I could maybe map the code review to the in progress column and maybe call this in development. So what that means is anything that's either in progress or code review means that it's with the development team. So you could do it that way and then come back. Now, obviously the code review column gets removed because there is no status mapped to it. So now we've got in development, and you see that this issue that is in code review is now showing up in this column. So let me show you a downside that happens when I do this based on how the workflow is. So just to refresh your memory, I can move it from to do to in progress to code review. Alright, so if I take this bug ticket here, I can move it into the in progress column. And even though there are multiple statuses mapped to it, it's only allowed me to move to in progress, which is why I only saw one highlight. So now from in progress, notice how I can't do anything. That's because the only step that's allowed, so it looks like this status is not getting updated, but I probably need to just do a refresh. So the only thing that's allowed, the only transition that's allowed from in progress onwards is to code review. But code review is mapped to the same column. So that's why I can't move it to another status in the same column. So for that reason alone, it is better that I have code review as a separate column just based on how the workflow has been configured. So now code review shows up, and if I want to, I can move that in there accordingly. But what about our spike issue? So let me take one of the spike issues that we created and let me move them into the sprint. Actually, I'll take maybe two of these. I'll multi-select them and move them into the sprint. Okay, so now when I go back to the sprint view, they should show up here. Okay, so based on the spike workflow, which we can just look at again, it's simple: to do, in progress, done. So that means I should be able to take this and move it into the in development. Well, now it's called in development column, but it's got the in progress status mapped to it. And then from here, I can only take it to the done column because it doesn't utilize a status that is mapped to these columns in the middle. So from in progress, I can move it to done, and there you go. So even though the spike issue type uses a completely different workflow, some of the statuses, in fact all the statuses, end up overlapping with the other workflow. So because the statuses are all mapped to columns already, that's why I can move the spike issue type accordingly. It's just that I can only move them to the columns that are mapped to a status that is part of the spike issue type workflow. Now another thing to note is that when I moved that spike issue to the done column, it did not strike off the issue key, but you notice that all the other ones have it struck through, meaning that the resolution of these issues was set when I moved it to the done column. So that means the resolution is not being set every time I move or mark a spike as being done. So that's something we will actually look at in a couple of videos, where we will set the resolution field as part of a transition post function. But before we get into that, I just want to walk through some random scenarios to show you various things. And the main purpose is that, if you ever come to a board and you notice that some issues are not, or some transitions are not working, and it's just acting funky, how would you go about looking into it? You'd go to the columns, you'd go to the workflow. So I just want to walk through some random scenarios just to show you various different things that can happen. So like I said, some of these statuses between the spike workflow and the other workflow, they are common. Well, what if they're not common? So for example, I can drag this spike issue into this column because it's in the in progress status, and so is this bug. This bug is also in the in progress status. But what if these two were using a different status? So how would that work? Let's take a look at that. So I'm going to go back to the workflow, and let's go to the workflows page. Actually, that is the one that I want to see. So let me go into that. And what I'll do is I'll actually edit the workflow. So now we're in draft mode again. And instead of in progress, I'm going to use maybe in dev to represent this workflow. Now, once again, as a refresher, it is not recommended to edit and actually modify this status, because then you'll affect all the other workflows that use the status. So you're better off just adding a new one, and let's call it in dev. Click add. It's in progress. Okay, so let's just move it in here, and I will update all the transitions accordingly to just use the new status. Okay, that's it. So now it looks like in progress is not being used. I can move that out, and then I can move this back in, and maybe I can just clean this up to make it look a little better. It's not looking the best. Oh, that's because I moved the wrong one. So let me just do this again. This is the one I want to go here. Move this back in. Okay, that's slightly cleaner. Okay, now I have made all these changes, and I can go ahead and publish this draft without any issues. But this in progress status is there, it's not being used, so I might as well remove it, right? But it's not going to let me remove a status from an active workflow. So I'm gonna have to leave it in there for now, but nothing is really touching the status, so it shouldn't affect anything. So let me go ahead and publish this. So once again, it'll ask you for a backup copy, but you could say no and hit publish. So now those changes have been saved and it's using the in dev status. So let me go back to the board, and I think I'm going to need a couple more issues. So let me just go back to the backlog, And let me just bring in one of these issues in there. Okay, going back to the sprint view. So now if I drag this and try to move it, oh, it shouldn't let me do that. Let me just refresh this. Yeah, it looks like Atlassian is having some refresh issues right now. So anyway, I just brought this issue into the sprint. Now you can see I can't drag it anywhere. It's going to give me an error. So one way to look into that is let's take a look at the columns again. So I'm going to go to the board settings. Let me refresh this. There you go. So that new status that we just added is not mapped to any column. So we need to bring that in and map it to this. And let me switch this back to being in progress. Okay, so now if I come back here, maybe need to do another refresh. Okay, there you go. So now I can map it in. All right, so we have this issue. Once again, these statuses are not refreshing, and that's a little annoying. So once I refresh, I'm sure it'll say in progress. Or in dev, I guess, because that is now what the new status is that this workflow is using, while the spike issue type is going to continue with the in progress status. But let's look at this bug. This bug was sitting in this column from before, and this bug is still in the in progress status. Well, didn't we update the workflow to use in dev? We did, but the problem is the in progress status is still there. Even though it's not being used, it's still there, and an issue was already in that status from before. So you'll notice that I can't move this to anywhere because the status is not linked to anything. So it looks like I do have to come in here and I do have to remove this. And it's not going to let me do that on a live workflow. So I need to go through that whole process again of making a copy, making the change, and then switching it back to the main one. So I'm just going to go through the steps really quickly. So first, let's go to the workflows page. Let's create another copy of this. I'll call it copy 2, copy number 2, that's fine. Okay, so that is created, it's inactive. Let's go to the workflow scheme. Let's edit the workflow scheme. And I want to add existing copy number 2. Next, all unassigned issue types, finish, and then publish. Associate, and acknowledge. And then let's go back to workflows, go down to the inactive section, find our workflow, which is right here, click edit, and now we can click in progress and remove the status, remove, done. So now we go back to workflow schemes and then we edit this again and switch it back. So we want the PEP, so just make sure in progress is missing, so that's good. Click next, same thing, and publish. Alright, so now this is a new step that we are seeing. Because we had that bug that is currently in progress, but now that we have removed the in progress status, Jira asks you, hey, what do you want all the issues that were in progress? What status do you want them to be mapped to now? So you can see it lists out all the issue types in the projects, and it's actually telling me how many issues in each of the issue types actually have that in progress status right now. I don't need to worry about epic and task because there are no issues that are either epic or tasks that are in the in progress status. So it doesn't matter what I map to that, but for example, story, I want that to become in dev. Same thing for the subtask, same thing for the bug. Okay, so then we hit associate, and now it's going to publish it. Acknowledge, and we can go back to our board, and let me just refresh to be safe. And now that we have the bug selected, you can see it is now in dev, and I can move it forward accordingly. Alright, So that was a look at how you can modify and tweak your Agile boards based on the workflows being configured for the issue types appearing on the board. And I also wanted to walk through some scenarios where, if things are acting a little weird, then just take a look at your columns, take a look at your workflows, and that is how you can investigate and see what's happening, and then make your changes accordingly. Let's take a deeper dive into transitions in workflows and what you can do during a transition. There are a couple of things, and we will walk through them one at a time. So the workflow we'll be working with is the spike workflow again. So let's go ahead and click on Edit. And while you're in the Edit mode, anytime you select a transition in the diagram mode, you will see this little box that appears here with a couple of options for the transition. Things like properties, triggers, conditions, validators, and post functions. And we will go over them one by one over the next couple of videos. The first thing I wanted to show you is how to display a screen during a transition. So the scenario that we're going to create here is that whenever a spike ticket is complete, or the work for it is done, you want the user to put in all the details and results of the spike. And we had created a field for that called spike results. So what I'm going to do is let's select the done transition and click on Edit. And down here at the bottom you can see the option to display a screen. So I can come here and look for the screen that displays the spike results field, and that is the spike issue screen. And then click Save. So now you can see that it's displaying the screen during the transition. And let's go ahead and publish that draft. Now let's go back to the board and let me just refresh to be safe. Okay, so now we have our test spike ticket here in the in progress status, and I can click and drag it to the done column. And there you go, that issue or the screen now displays whenever I do the transition. And I can come and scroll down here, look for the spike results field, and then put in that information. Now, normally you wouldn't want this elaborate screen to display during a transition. You would want maybe a very simple screen, because if that is all you want the user to do, then you might as well just have a new screen with just that one field on it. So I'm going to cancel this for now, and let's go ahead and create that screen. So we will go through some of the things we've already covered, just as a refresher. So let's go ahead and go to the screens page, and I'm going to add a screen. And let's call this the spike results screen. Click Add. And so now there are no fields in the screen, but I can go ahead and look for the spike results. And that's the only field I want on the screen. Now I can go back to the workflows. And let's edit the spike workflow again. Select the transition, click Edit, and now let's look for the spike results screen, save, and publish. Now let's try that again. So now if I drag this over to the done column, I get a very simple screen. Now keep in mind that comments will usually appear on every single screen. Now I can go in and put in my comments and then click Done. And now it's in the Done column and it has the details or results of the spike. So that's a quick look at how you can display a screen during a transition. Now we will go ahead and take a look at the other options. Okay, let's look at properties. And this time I'm actually going to edit the other workflow used in the project by the other issue types. So I'll click on Edit. And once again, if you select any transition, you have those options available. Now, properties is actually a bit more advanced and not very commonly used, but I can still show you a couple examples. They basically allow you to do some very specific functionality in the workflow. And the best resource to use for that is Atlassian's documentation on properties, which I have open in a separate tab. So Jira defines a few properties listed out here, and I'm not really going to go through each and every one of them. It's something you can definitely take a look at and read up on in your own time. But just to give you an example, so maybe I can talk about the ops bar sequence. So what this does is it allows you to specify the order of your transitions. So let me come back to the board, and looking at this issue right here, which is currently in code review, I have the ability to either move it back to dev so that it goes into the in-dev status or ready for testing. Now you can see the order here is that the back to dev transition appears first. This ops bar sequence property lets you rearrange the order of the transitions. Now keep in mind that these properties, I believe, do not fully work yet with the new issue view, but they definitely do work with the older issue view. So what I'm going to do is I'll open up this issue in its own tab. So once again, back to dev and then ready for testing. Let me open up the old view in another tab as well. Okay, interestingly enough, in the old view, it's showing ready for testing first and then back to dev. Okay, so let me come back to the properties, or actually I'll come back to the workflow. So regarding code review, I have these two transitions available. I'll click on back to dev and let me click on properties. By default, it opens up in its own tab, and I'll do the same thing for ready for testing. Okay, so in this old issue view, ready for testing appears first, so let's make it appear second. So that means I would want back to dev to be a smaller number, and I'll explain that in just a second. So coming into back to dev, using the workflow properties document, I'll copy this property. And of course, each one of these has corresponding links that you can click on to read up more on it. So let me come into back to dev. I'll put in the property key, and the property value will just be an integer greater than 0. So for example, let's just go with 10. I'll click add, and the ready for testing, I'll do the same thing, but this time I'll specify a number that's bigger than 10, so 20. And let me close these out, and now I have to publish the workflow. And now if I go back to the old issue view, and let me do a refresh, you see how they switched? So back to dev has a smaller integer for that ops bar sequence property, so it appears first. But in the new issue view, it really made no difference. Let me try refreshing. Yep, it's the same thing as before. Okay. So let me edit this again. And the reason I have to click on edit every time is because when you're just viewing the workflow, when you click on the transition, this box does not appear. It only appears in edit mode for some reason. I hope Atlassian makes that better in the future. Alright, so now you can also specify properties for statuses. So if I click on done and click on properties, again it'll open up in its own tab. And another example I can show you is the Jira issue editable property. So what that means is that if I come in for this done status, set the property, and the options available are true or false. So if I come in and set it to false, what that means is whenever an issue goes to the done status, it is not going to be editable. So right now, let me actually close these windows and let me open up an issue that is done. And again, I will open that up in its own tab. And I don't believe it fully works in the new issue view, so let me have the old issue view as well. And you can see that this has an edit button over here for me to be able to edit the issue even though it's already done. So now if I come in, I've added the property, let me close this and let me publish. And now when I come back here and I refresh, you can see the edit button is longer there. So these are just two examples I wanted to show you. Feel free to read up on these properties and see if they are something you'd like to use in your own workflows. So I'll go ahead and close up my tabs. All right. I'll click, and just to show you, so if I try to click on these transitions, nothing really happens. I have to go into edit mode, and then once I click on a transition, I can see it. So coming to triggers, Triggers basically represent an event that takes place outside of Jira that triggers a transition to happen automatically. So for example, if you're using Bitbucket to manage your source code, then every time you create a pull request, you can transition the issue automatically from in progress to code review. And that's something that would happen automatically. Here I don't have Bitbucket synced with Jira, so I'm not able to show you what that looks like, but you would just click add trigger and it would give you a bunch of options. And that's how you can automatically initiate transitions based on something that happens in an external tool. Alright, and that leaves us with conditions, validators, and post functions. So let's see if we can run through all three of them in the next video. Let's take a look at the remaining transition functions, and I'm actually going to swap back to the Spike workflow now because some of the functions will actually make sense for what I'm trying to show. So I'll switch over to the diagram, and let's select the in progress to done transition, and we'll click on conditions. So it takes me to the same page with tabs for each of those functions. So conditions basically represent, well, a condition that needs to be met or satisfied in order for that transition to take place, or basically allow that transition to even happen. So you can come in and click add condition, and there are a bunch of different options. Now I won't go through all of them, but there is a nice description for each condition. So for example, only assignee condition allows only the assignee to execute a transition. Same thing with reporter. You can do it by permissions. You could even specify that, the user has to be in a group or project role, or even a value field, which will only allow the transition to execute if the given value of a field is equal to some value. So for our purposes, and just once again for example purposes, I'm going to select that the user has to be in a project role. I'll click add, and now here I can select which project role is allowed to execute the transition. So we're looking at the Spike issue type, and usually it would be a developer that works on the Spike ticket. So I'm going to say that only the developer can mark a Spike ticket as done. So I'll click add, and then we go ahead and publish. Now just keep in mind that this opened, when I clicked on the condition, it opened it up in its own tab. I still have the workflow here. This has a publish draft button, but so does this. I can publish it from either or. So if I do it from here, and if I go in and refresh, you'll see that, I've already published it, so that draft doesn't exist anymore. So I'll just click on the workflow page again, and this one I can close. So now if I go to the PEP board, looks like I need a couple of Spike issue types to work with. So I'll go to the backlog, and let me use this one. I'll move it into the sprint, confirm, active sprints. Okay, so now I will move it first into the in progress column. And then from here, now you can see I'm not able to drag it into the done column. If I do so, I get an error because I am logged in as the administrator. So what I will do now, just to make sure it does work for the developer, let me go to the user management section, and I'm going to log in as the KS developer account because this is the user that was assigned the developer project role. So let's log in, and I can access the board from here. And now I'm going to try to move this issue, and looks like I can. And obviously I'll get the Spike results screen, and I can go in and put in my Spike results. So I'll just hit cancel. I just wanted to show that the transition is in fact possible. I'll switch back to the admin account now. Okay, I can close this. So that is a look at the conditions. So let me go back to editing the Spike workflow, to diagram. Okay, I will select the same transition, and you can see that now we have a condition. What I'm going to do is I will actually remove that condition just so that it doesn't affect anything I want to demo going forward. Alright, so let's talk about validators. Validators are a means for you to check something before letting that transition go through or execute. So the perfect example is that this is in the Spike workflow. We're going from in progress to done, And we saw in one of the videos before that we set up a screen to be displayed during this transition where we want the user to enter in the spike results. So what we could do, and if you remember, that spike results field is not required. So the user may bypass it without really putting anything in. So what I'm going to do is I will add a validator. And once again, there are many to choose from, and feel free to test and play around with a lot of these different options available. What I will do is I will select and demo with the field required validator, click add, and now I just need to look for the spike results field, click add, and then put in my error message, and then click add. Alright, and then once again publish this draft. Okay, so coming back to the board, I removed the condition, so let me just refresh this page just to be safe. So now I can take this issue and I can drag it in as the administrator since the condition was removed. And even though spike results doesn't have any red asterisk beside it, so one might think that, all right, I don't need to put this in. I'm just going to be a rebel and I'm just going to hit done. But no, because we've set up a validator, it's going to display that error message that we provided. Please enter the spike results. So I have to go in and say something over here. These are the results, and click done, and only then will it let the transition execute, and now you see that it's marked as done. So that's a look at the validators. So let me once again go back here. Right, this was in draft, but I think we published it, so it's no longer available. Yep, so I have to go back to workflows, and let's click edit again. The last thing that we need to look at now is the post function. So what I will use the post function for is, remember, and I mentioned this before, that all these other issues are getting the resolution set and the issue key being struck through, but that's not happening for spikes. So we need to make sure that the resolution field gets set every time a spike ticket is marked as done, and we can do that using the post function. So coming back to the workflow, I have the transition selected. You can see we now have a validator. I'll leave that as is, and let's go and take a look at the post functions. So these are the post functions set up by default. So things like it's going to set the status of the issue to the linked status in the destination workflow step. It's going to put the comment under the ticket if one was entered. So for example, if we displayed a screen and the user entered a comment, then it'll add the comment under the issue. It's going to change things like the history and a couple of other things that, Jira just needs to do as part of any workflow transition. But we can go in and we can add our own post function. And once again, there are a lot of options to choose from. So you can assign it to a particular user. You can copy a value from other field. What I'm going to do is I will update an issue field. Click add. And we want the resolution. And let's say that we are going to mark it as done and click add. And of course, we need to publish. All right. So the final demo, and I'm going to need another spike ticket. So we'll go back to the backlog. We don't have any more, so I will create one. So I think this is spike 5. Click enter. Of course, we're seeing this again. Our description and the spike type field is required, so it didn't let me just create the issue. I need to come in and actually provide some data for this. Hit create. Alright, so now the ticket's there. Let's move it into the sprint. Okay, so the first step, I'm just going to do a quick refresh just to be safe. Alright, so the first step is to drag it into the in progress column, and now the moment of truth, when I bring it into done, I'm going to get the pop-up. I have to put in something here. I can click done, and there you go. So it looks like the strike through is there, and when I click on the issue, if I do another refresh, there you go. You can see the resolution is being set, and it is set to done. All right. Pretty awesome stuff, right? We've taken a look at a lot of things around workflows. We've created a new workflow from scratch. We've edited an existing one and added some new statuses and transitions, and then mapped those statuses to columns in our Agile board, and then finally looked at workflow transitions and things that you can do before, during, and even after a transition takes place. There's a lot to work with over here, and I definitely recommend going in and playing around with workflows yourself, because practice makes perfect, and it will make you more and more comfortable and faster when it comes to working with workflows.